sound was soft, almost polite. Rubber struck paper. A pause. Then again. Rubber struck paper. In the archive wing of the Federal Ministry of Finance in Berlin, where fluorescent light flattened every color into the same tired shade of gray, Matthias Voss sat alone with a stack of pension transfer forms and listened to the rhythm like a heartbeat that did not belong to any living body. The stamp in his hand marked each reviewed page with the date, the file number, and the quiet authority of the state. Approved, logged, closed. That was how most secrets survived. Not in darkness, not in locked rooms, not in whispered meetings behind smoked glass. They survived in broad daylight, buried under tidy columns, sealed with signatures, fed through scanners, indexed in systems no one had reason to doubt. They survived because bureaucracy did not need to lie loudly. It only needed to repeat itself until repetition looked like order. Outside, February rain pressed against the windows in thin diagonal lines. Evening had already settled over the city, though it was not yet 6. From the corridor came the distant rattle of a cleaning trolley and the hum of an old ventilation system pushing stale warmth through the building. Matthias barely noticed either sound. He was watching a monitor filled with numbers. At 55, he had developed the patience of a man who trusted patterns more than people. His hair, once dark, had thinned to steel grey above a broad, careful face. He wore rimless glasses that sat low on his nose when he read, and a dark wool jacket he never removed in overheated offices. He moved with the restraint of someone who had spent decades learning that haste created blind spots. In 4 months, he was due to retire. The thought should have comforted him. His wife, Sabine, had already begun collecting brochures for river cruises. She wanted mornings without alarm clocks, a smaller apartment closer to the main, weekends with their daughter in Wiesbaden, perhaps a rented house on the North Sea in autumn. She had said it often enough that it had become their future by force of repetition. Matthias had nodded at the right moments. He had even meant it, in theory. But some men spent their whole lives listening for irregularities, and the habit did not surrender just because a date had been entered into a personnel file. At 1342, his auditing software flagged an anomaly in a government pension database. On screen, the alert appeared as a modest amber box in the corner of a spreadsheet so large it seemed to have no edge. No alarm, no dramatic sound. Just a notation from a system he had helped refine years earlier. Recurring disbursement pattern inconsistent with beneficiary status. Review required. Matthias leaned closer. The source account was old, almost forgotten, attached to a dormant federal agricultural relief fund established in the early 1980s to support livestock farmers after a disease outbreak along the Belgian border. The fund itself should have been irrelevant now, little more than a historical placeholder preserved for compliance. Yet every quarter, on the same date, 12 payments moved out of it in identical amounts. Routed through intermediary reimbursement codes and ministry-cleared medical channels before vanishing into a cluster of special authority accounts. 12 beneficiaries. He clicked open the registry fields. The names were redacted in the live interface, which in itself was unusual for a civilian subsidy archive. He entered a higher-level verification token, one granted to forensic auditors for cross-ministerial reconciliation. The system hesitated. Then it resolved the linked records. Matthias did not blink for several seconds. The 12 recipients were all listed as deceased. Not missing, not retired under protection, not archived under witness status. Deceased, date of death 14th September 1988. Cause attached through military registry synchronization, Luftfahrzeugabsturz, aircraft crash. He read the names once, then again. All 12 belonged to the same Bundeswehr transport unit that had died in a helicopter crash near Baumholder in an accident so widely reported at the time that even civilians remembered the images. Burning wreckage in a wet field, flags over coffins. A defense minister speaking with grave precision in Mekern into a bank of microphones. Matthias had been 17 then, old enough to remember the television coverage. Old enough to remember his father muttering that the military always disclosed only what it could no longer hide. He opened the payment history. The transfers had continued for 30 years, not pensions in the ordinary sense. The coding was wrong for that. Too medical, too compartmentalized. Reimbursement markers pointed toward long-term pharmaceutical stipends, specialized care disbursements, logistical procurement support. The sums were too high and too consistent to be clerical residue. This was active maintenance. His office suddenly felt colder. He checked the room behind him, though there was no reason to. The corridor remained empty. Rain scratched the glass. Far below in the courtyard, a lone security lamp cast a dull circle over wet paving stones. Matthias returned to the screen and began doing what he trusted most. He checked the facts logically. He pulled the death records from the Federal Civil Archive. Valid. He opened the crash report index. Sealed summary only, most attachments restricted by military authority. He cross-referenced tax IDs against inheritance closures. Finalized. He searched for cancellation orders that might explain why the payments had not ceased after death declarations. None. Instead, he found retroactive legal shielding applied in 1991 under an emergency health expenditure directive that made no reference to any of the men by name. A simple administrative error could survive months. A sophisticated one might survive years. But 30 years required stewardship. That meant somebody knew. He exported the transaction strings into a local review sheet and ran a root analysis through an older forensic model the ministry rarely used anymore because it was considered too slow for modern throughput. Matthias preferred slow systems. Slow systems showed their work. One path in the chain broke away from the others, branching into a pharmaceutical reimbursement node attached to a licensed dispensing network in Rhineland-Palatinate. A prescription authorization had been processed 11 days earlier. His mouth dried. Beneficiary code matched one of the deceased soldiers. The drug name meant nothing to him at first. L47 imine modulator compound, restricted access, non-public registration. He searched the Federal Medicinal Database. No civilian release, no approved commercial circulation, no standard military formulary record. Yet the pharmacy transaction was authentic, digitally signed and marked as collected in person by a classified proxy authorization near a restricted military zone in the Eifel region. Collected in person. Matthias removed his glasses and cleaned them, though they were not dirty. He had done this since his 30s, whenever a fact arrived that his mind rejected before accepting. The gesture bought him a few seconds in which the world could still be ordinary. When he put the glasses back on, the data had not changed. One of the dead men had received medicine less than 2 weeks ago. His phone vibrated on the desk. Sabine. He watched her name appear, then answered. "You are still there," she said, not asking. "A little longer." "You said that an hour ago." He looked again at the 12 names. There is a discrepancy in an old file. A soft exhale came through the line. He could picture her standing in their kitchen in Frankfurt, one hand on the counter, patient but already resigned. "Matthias, every file is old to you. I know. Then come home before the weather gets worse." He almost said yes. He almost shut the system down, logged the anomaly for morning review, and walked away from the amber warning box that had opened like a small wound in the center of his screen. Instead, he asked, "Do you remember the helicopter crash in '88? The Bundeswehr transport outside Baumholder?" There was a pause. "Vaguely." "Why?" Matthias stared at the prescription record, at the classified medical code, at the line showing a collection point less than 20 kilometers from a restricted perimeter in the Eifel. "Because," he said quietly, "one of the men who died in it may have just picked up his medication." This time Sabine said nothing at all. In the silence, somewhere deep in the ministry network, another file opened under his credentials, and on the bottom of his screen, without any command from him, a black access banner appeared. "Audit routine detected. External oversight notified." The next morning, Frankfurt looked as if it had been assembled from glass, fog, and restraint. A low winter sky hung over the financial district, turning the upper floors of the bank towers into pale shapes suspended in cloud. The Main moved under the bridges like dark metal. Office lights flickered on behind polished facades, one floor after another, while commuters crossed plazas with their collars raised and their eyes lowered against the cold. In this part of the city, money rarely announced itself. It settled into stone, steel, tinted windows, and the quiet confidence of buildings that expected to outlive the people inside them. Matthias Voss lived just south of the river with Sabine in a modest apartment that had once been temporary and had somehow become permanent. It was on the third floor of a clean, aging building with narrow stairs, an old brass mailbox panel, and a courtyard where nothing grew well except ivy. Their kitchen faced east. In the mornings, when the weather allowed it, the light came in softly over the rooftops and made the table look warmer than it was. But that morning, the sky gave them only a flat grey glow. Sabine was already dressed when he entered, wrapped in a dark cardigan, her reading glasses resting low on her nose as she scanned the culture pages of the Frankfurter Allgemeine. She had arranged breakfast with the care of habit rather than optimism. Rye bread in a basket, butter on a small plate, apricot jam, strong coffee, sliced cheese, 2 boiled eggs. Their life together had never depended on grand gestures. It rested on smaller disciplines: meals, timing, the ordinary mercy of not making the other explain every silence. She looked up as he poured coffee. "You slept 3 hours," she said. 4. "That means 3.5. He sat opposite her and let the cup warm his hands. His shoulders ached from the previous night. The tendons in his neck felt tight, and behind his eyes there was the dry pressure that came when he had followed a problem too long without resolution. He had gone to bed after 1, but sleep had been shallow and arranged in fragments. Again and again he had seen the same line on the monitor, collected in person. Sabine folded the newspaper. "You want to tell me what happened?" Matthias hesitated, not because he distrusted her, quite the opposite. He trusted her enough to fear what the truth would bring into the room. For 32 years, Sabine had served as a quiet corrective to his instincts. Where Matthias pursued completion, Sabine recognized sufficiency. Where he could not leave an inconsistency alone, she knew which cracks in the world were structural and which would simply widen if touched. She had once taught literature at a gymnasium in Offenbach. Now she worked part-time in the administrative office of a museum, surrounded by catalogues, donor lists, and restoration requests. She understood records better than most people, though from the human side rather than the fiscal one. That was one of the reasons he had married her. She respected order without worshipping it. He told her enough to make the matter real, but not enough to make it dangerous. An old subsidy fund, 12 unexplained medical disbursements, dead recipients, a military crash in 1988, a prescription filled recently under one of the names. Sabine listened without interrupting, which was rarely a good sign. When he finished, she touched the edge of her cup and stared past him toward the dark window. "Then it is not a clerical error," she said. "No. And if it touches the Defense Ministry, it will not remain an accounting question for long." Matthias said nothing. She looked back at him. "You are not young enough anymore to believe that truth protects the person who finds it." The sentence landed without bitterness. That made it harder to resist. Years earlier, when their daughter Lena had still lived at home, Matthias had uncovered a procurement fraud case involving customs inspections and a state-owned logistics contractor. He had spent 14 months reconstructing false invoices through 3 jurisdictions and 2 private intermediaries. The outcome had been legally successful. Convictions, public praise, committee commendations. But by the end of it, Matthias had been waking at 4 in the morning with chest pain, and Lena had learned to stop asking whether he would be home for dinner. Sabine had never forbidden him from caring too much. She had only lived beside the consequences. "I can make a note and transfer it upward," Matthias said, though he did not believe his own voice. Sabine held his gaze. "Will you?" He took a sip of coffee that had already cooled. "No." A small, tired smile passed over her face, gone almost at once. Not approval, merely recognition. "Then at least do not lie to yourself about what this is," she said. "You are months from retirement, Matthias. We were supposed to leave all of this behind." He glanced toward the hallway where 2 travel brochures sat on a side table beneath a bowl of keys. One showed a white ship on the Rhine in late summer, the other wind-bent grasses along the North Sea coast. Those images suddenly seemed to belong to another couple, one with simpler bones and fewer habits of suspicion. "I know," he said. Sabine reached for the newspaper again, but did not open it. "You always say that." He left the apartment at 07:20, with his scarf wrapped higher than usual and the old leather briefcase he refused to replace. The S-Bahn platform smelled of wet concrete, machine oil and burnt coffee from a kiosk at the entrance. Passengers waited in the practiced silence of weekday mornings, their faces reflected faintly in the glass barriers. A child in a red coat stood between two adults and counted pigeons under her breath. Somewhere down the platform, a phone played a short burst of tinny music before being silenced. Matthias watched the train arrive and found himself thinking, absurdly, of the men from the registry. 12 names, sealed in public memory, still moving through hidden ledgers. If they were alive, then for 30 years every surface record surrounding their deaths had been maintained with bureaucratic precision. Pensions closed, estates settled, widows acknowledged, files frozen, a deception that large did not drift, it had to be serviced. At the Ministry Annex in Frankfurt, where his current audit team occupied 2 floors of a post-war administrative block near Willy Brandt-Platz, the day began as all official days began. Security badge, elevator, corridor light, coat hook, computer boot sequence, unread internal mail. Around him, colleagues moved through their routines with the ordinary exhaustion of late career civil service. Someone laughed in the break room. Someone complained about an insurance circular. A printer jammed and was cursed at in dialect. The world remained offensively normal. Matthias preferred arriving before most of them. It gave him 30 or 40 minutes in which systems could be checked without interruption, and the building still belonged to deliberate people. He placed his briefcase beside the desk, removed his jacket, and sat. The amber flag was still there. Only now the file access permissions had changed. 3 of the cross-linked military attachments he had viewed the previous evening were no longer available to his clearance level. A notation had been inserted at 0211 under Emergency Archival Review Authority. Further access restricted pending jurisdictional verification. Matthias stared at the screen. Files did not close themselves in the night. He opened his local export copy and began again from the financial side. Payment intervals, routing nodes, embedded reimbursement authorizations. The anomaly was intact because finance systems were less elegant than defense ones and harder to clean quickly. Numbers stayed dirty longer than narratives. He rebuilt the transaction path manually, following ministry clearances through intermediary accounts held by medical supply firms in Koblenz, Bonn, and Luxembourg. Most of the expenditures terminated in innocuous categories: long-term care, laboratory storage, maintenance contracts, pharmaceutical transport. But repetition created contour. Certain vendors recurred too often and in the wrong combination: sealed refrigeration units, negative pressure containment seals, water filtration membranes rated for chemical and biological environments, specialty waste disposal under defense exemption. This was not the financial footprint of pensions. It was the footprint of a facility. At 0918, his colleague Petra Weiss appeared at the edge of his doorway with a stack of folders balanced against her hip. Petra was in her early 40s, exact in speech and merciless towards sloppy reasoning. One of the few people in the office Matthias respected without reservation. "You look terrible," she said. "Good morning to you as well." She set the folders down on a cabinet. "You were in the system late. Compliance log flagged your session." He kept his eyes on the monitor. "Insomnia is productive." Petra did not laugh. Her attention drifted to the spreadsheet. "What are you in?" He considered deflecting. Instead, he said, "An agricultural relief account with medical leakage." "Leakage where?" "That is the question." She came closer. Petra had the useful habit of reading screens without commenting until she had enough information to be dangerous. Matthias watched her expression sharpen almost imperceptibly. "Those beneficiary codes are military," she said. "Yes." "Then why is it sitting in our civilian subsidy database?" "Also, my question," she lowered her voice, "do you want me to pretend I never saw this?" "For now, yes." Petra studied him for another moment. "That means it is already bad." "Not yet." She gave him the kind of look one gives a doctor who insists a wound is superficial while the blood runs under the door. "Matthias, if defense retroactively locked files overnight, then someone noticed you." He knew she was right. What unsettled him was how quickly the thought had stopped feeling paranoid. and started feeling procedural. After she left, he opened the pharmaceutical node again. The same restricted compound, the same regional dispensing authorization. He searched adjacent supply orders connected to the pharmacy license and discovered a transport invoice filed under an outsourced medical logistics subcontractor. The delivery address itself was masked, but the postal routing code remained visible for 1 second before the field collapsed behind a permissions curtain. 56479, Rhineland-Palatinate, Eifel Periphery. He wrote it down by hand. At lunch, he did not join the others. He took his sandwich to the records room, where shelves of boxed paper softened the acoustics and the air smelled faintly of cardboard dust. There he requested archived press material on the 1988 helicopter crash, not through the digital press service, but through microfilm references old enough to escape current keyword surveillance. It was a trick he had learned from an older auditor, long dead now. If current systems were curated, go backward until the state forgot you were looking. The newspaper coverage showed what everyone had been meant to remember. A training flight, sudden mechanical failure, rapid fire, no survivors, ceremonial burial with sealed caskets due to severe burn damage. Brief inquiry, no public irregularities, no mention of delayed body identification, no mention of medical quarantine, no mention of why a civilian agricultural account would later fund biological-grade containment equipment for 30 years. He turned the reel one frame at a time until an image stopped him. A photograph from the memorial service. Widows in black coats beneath umbrellas, officers standing rigid in the rain, a row of floral wreaths against damp stone. On the margin of the scanned caption, nearly lost in the grain, was a handwritten note from an editor or archivist, probably made decades earlier and never intended for anyone else to notice. Check discrepancy in family count. One spouse absent. Matthias leaned in until the machine's glass fogged faintly with his breath. One spouse absent. 12 dead soldiers. 11 officially photographed families. He copied the real reference, returned the microfilm, and walked back to his office with a sensation he had not felt in years. Not fear exactly, but the cold tightening that comes when a pattern stops being abstract and begins to behave like intent. By late afternoon, the strange detail had not faded, it had sharpened. The missing widow, the restricted pharmacy transaction, the facility-shaped expenditures, the altered permissions. Each fact could perhaps be explained alone. Together they formed something less innocent. At 17:03, an internal message arrived with no greeting and no signature. Report all findings on file AGR 4E immediately. Do not duplicate materials. Await further instruction. He read it once, then checked the sender route. The message had not come from the Ministry of Finance. It came from a defense network relay using a classification protocol that should never have touched his inbox at all. And attached to it was a scanned death certificate from 1988 for one of the 12 men. Across the certificate, in a faint diagonal line only visible when the screen brightness shifted, was a watermark Matthias had not seen the night before. Amended copy. By Wednesday morning, Matthias had stopped telling himself he was merely verifying an irregularity. Verification had rules. It respected channels. It produced memoranda, reference numbers, and cautious formulations designed to survive committee language. What he was doing now belonged to an older instinct, one he had spent most of his adult life trying to disguise beneath official procedure. He was following the point where a ledger stopped behaving like a ledger and began behaving like a witness. The Frankfurt annex was quieter than usual. A transport strike had thinned the hallways. Several desks remained empty, lights off, screens dark. Rain had passed in the night, leaving the windows filmed with a pale residue and the city beyond them colorless. The towers of the Banken Viertelay stood motionless behind the glass, their reflective skins taking no interest in the lives below. Matthias liked the weather better this way. Sunlight made public buildings perform optimism. Grey weather told the truth. He arrived before 8 with 2 files in his briefcase and a growing awareness that his ordinary life was already beginning to recede. The kitchen conversation with Sabine lingered in him like a bruise. Not because they had argued, they rarely did. What unsettled him was her accuracy. She knew, perhaps before he did, that he had already crossed the line between curiosity and commitment. At his desk, he opened the amended death certificate again. The watermark ran diagonally across the scanned paper in faint official lettering. Ersatzdokument, interne Berichtigung. Replacement document, internal correction. There was no visible explanation of what had been corrected. The date of issue remained October 1988. The seal matched the military registry, and the signature belonged to an officer whose name Matthias only half remembered from a procurement review in the late 1990s. What mattered was not what the certificate said. It was the fact that someone had quietly replaced a death document while preserving the outward fiction of finality. A dead man with an amended certificate. That was not an error, it was maintenance. He began with the pharmacy transaction. Civilian prescription records were not his natural territory, but financial authorizations always left sediment. Every reimbursement passed through a chain of signatures, reference markers, and insurance abstractions designed to protect patients while preserving accountability. Matthias knew how to read around the privacy barriers. He did not need the medical contents. He needed the administrative joints where systems touched each other badly. The dispensing license belonged to a pharmacy outside Gerolstein, little more than a rural branch tied to a wholesale network that served clinics, care homes, and industrial first aid depots throughout the Eifel region. On its own, that meant nothing. But the reimbursement path was wrong. Instead of settling through a statutory insurer or a Bundeswehr health account, the payment had been routed through a special procurement authorization linked to a civilian laboratory supply company in Bonn. That company, in turn, had received quarterly maintenance retainers from 2 Luxembourg intermediaries Matthias had already flagged the night before. He expanded the node map. The visual network spread across his screen in pale lines and numbered circles. Pharmaceutical vendor, waste contractor, refrigeration supplier, filtration system installer, portable negative pressure enclosure manufacturer, not scattered purchases, coordinated infrastructure. The more he stripped away the labels, the clearer the shape became. This money was not supporting widows. It was supporting a sealed environment in which 12 long-term biological cases could be kept alive. A knock at his door broke the thought. Petra Weiss entered without waiting for permission, holding a paper folder instead of her tablet. She closed the door behind her more quietly than usual. "You have company at 11, she said. Matthias looked up. "Who told you?" "Registry scheduling. Room B on the 4th floor." Her face remained composed, but her voice was flatter than normal. "The visitors are from administrative review." That phrase means nothing. Exactly. He studied her for a moment. Petra was not prone to dramatics. If she had come in person, instead of sending an internal message, the warning was deliberate. "Did they ask about me by name?" "They asked whether anyone in our division had been working outside standard audit channels." She paused. "I said everyone here is too exhausted for creativity." That almost made him smile. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," she said. "Do you have copies?" Matthias kept his face still. Petra exhaled, "Then hide them properly." When she left, he took the local exports from his drive and moved them to an encrypted archive on an old external device he normally used only for offline reconciliation work. He placed the device inside a false-bottom stationery box in his briefcase, then returned to the digital trail. There was still the matter of the missing widow. He searched the archived memorial photographs and cross-referenced the names of the 12 dead soldiers against marriage records from the late 1980s. 11 were straightforward: married, engaged, or officially identified by next of kin. The 12th, Oberfeldwebel Henrik Adler, showed a civil marriage registration in Koblenz 6 months before the crash to a woman named Clara Adler, born Clara Neumann. No widow's pension application had ever been processed in her name. That was the first true clue that belonged to the world rather than the system. Because systems could be altered, people left residue. He checked address histories. Clara Adler had lived in Koblenz until 1991, then disappeared from most administrative visibility except for utility registrations and a small inheritance dispute involving her mother's apartment. 3 years later, she resurfaced under her maiden name in a village outside Bad Münstereifel. The postal code matched the same regional cluster he had written down from the pharmacy node. 56479 had not been exact after all. The masking field had distorted the last digits, but it had pointed him toward the right landscape. Uplands, forest roads, scattered villages, former NATO territory, and enough dead infrastructure left over from the Cold War to hide almost anything beneath the earth. He wrote Clara's address on a yellow legal pad, tore the page free, folded it into his jacket pocket, and told himself he was still gathering facts. At 11, he went upstairs to room B on the 4th floor. The room had no windows. Administrative review meetings were always staged in rooms like that, as if institutions preferred difficult conversations without weather. A water carafe sat untouched on the table. 2 men were waiting. Neither introduced himself immediately. The first was broad-shouldered, in a dark suit that did not quite fit like civilian tailoring. The second was older, thinner, with a discreet tie pin and the polished stillness of someone who had spent years inside secure corridors. Both had folders in front of them, but no laptops. "Herr Voss," said the older man, "thank you for coming." Matthias sat opposite them. "You requested me." "A minor procedural matter," the broad one said. His voice was neutral, though neutrality of that kind usually concealed training rather than temperament. The older man opened his folder. "You accessed a protected archival chain yesterday evening through a civilian audit credential. I accessed linked payment records under ministry authority, and then moved beyond your operational need. That depends on how one defines the need." A glance passed between them. The thin man folded his hands. "Some historical defense files," he said, "contain material that can be misread outside context. It is in everyone's interest to avoid unnecessary confusion. Then perhaps the context should be clearer." The broad man leaned back slightly. "This is not an invitation to debate classification policy." Matthias felt the old familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever someone tried to convert vagueness into authority. An agricultural subsidy account has funded undisclosed medical disbursements to 12 legally deceased servicemen for 3 decades. That is not confusion, that is a financial fact. No one spoke for a moment. Then the thin man said very softly, "Some facts are incomplete by design." It was the kind of sentence meant to sound profound. Instead, it sounded administrative, which was worse. Matthias kept his hands on the table. "Are the men alive?" Neither official answered. The silence was answer enough. The broad man slid a single sheet across the table. It was not a confession or a directive. It was a confidentiality acknowledgement, dense with legal phrasing and references to national security obligations already binding on federal personnel. "Sign this," he said, "and your involvement ends here." Matthias looked at the page but did not touch it. "My involvement began because your expenditures entered a civilian ministry account," he said. "That is not my procedural failure." The older man's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Something cooled behind the eyes. "Herr Voss," he said, "you are close to retirement. It would be unfortunate to complicate matters that should conclude quietly." There it was. Not the threat itself, but its architecture, pension, reputation, administrative friction. The state almost never needed crude force at first. It preferred pressure applied to the joints of a life. Matthias stood. "If you want my access suspended, do it formally. If you want these transactions regularized, produce lawful authority. If not, this meeting is over." The broad man did not rise. "You are making an emotional decision." Matthias picked up the unsigned paper and set it back down in the center of the table. "No," he said, "I am making an accounting one." He left before they could reply. Back in his office, his inbox contained 3 new notices. His access to 2 archival repositories had been temporarily restricted. His review rights on cross-ministerial defense-linked records were suspended pending verification, and his banking interface, the secure government portal through which federal employees could manage payroll-linked financial services, displayed a compliance banner he had never seen before. Routine anti-fraud review, certain account functions unavailable. For a moment, Matthias simply stared, then he checked his private bank app on his phone. Current account frozen, pending identity confirmation. Savings sub-account inaccessible. Mortgage transfer delayed. He sat very still, the phone growing warm in his hand. This was no longer a warning, it was pressure made tangible. Sabine would discover it by evening when the grocery card failed or a standing order bounced. The intrusion into his finances was clumsy enough to be deniable and precise enough to be understood. They wanted his attention divided. They wanted domestic anxiety where clarity had been. His first instinct was to call the bank. His second was to call Sabine. Instead, he placed the phone face down, closed his office door, and opened the only avenue still available to him. The human one. He searched local directories for Clara Neumann, formerly Adler, and found a landline registered to a narrow address outside Bad Münstereifel. No listed email, no business affiliation, no social presence worth naming. A person who had spent decades leaving as little trail as possible. Matthias dialed. The line rang 6 times. Then a woman answered. Her voice was low, cautious, and older than the marriage record, but unmistakably steady. Ja? Matthias did not identify himself as finance ministry staff. That would have ended the call. He said only, Frau Neumann, my name is Matthias Voss. I am reviewing historical records connected to your husband, Henrik Adler. I believe there may be information you were never given. Silence. For one terrible second, he thought the connection had dropped. Then she asked, in a voice nearly drained of breath, which version of his death are you looking at? Matthias felt the room contract around him. He closed his eyes. Outside his door, someone laughed at something in the corridor. A chair rolled across linoleum. A printer started up. The building went on with its day. But inside the silence on that line, the mystery stopped being abstract. Because somewhere in the Eifel, a woman who had officially lost her husband in 1988 had just implied there had always been more than one story. Clara Neumann did not agree to meet him at once. For several seconds after her question, Matthias heard nothing except the faint static of distance and the slow, controlled movement of her breathing. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Not softer, more guarded, as if she had stepped inward from an open doorway and was now deciding how much of herself to leave exposed. Who gave you this number? She asked. Public registry records, Matthias said. That was true, but not the whole truth. It sounded official enough to be credible and harmless enough not to close the line. And you are reviewing what exactly? Financial documents linked to Henrik Adler's death. He paused. Or what was recorded as his death. Another silence followed. In it, Matthias could hear a clock somewhere near her receiver, ticking with old-fashioned volume. Not digital, mechanical, the sound of a house that had learned to wait. People from ministries do not call widows after 38 years, she said. No, Matthias replied. They usually don't. The clock went on ticking. At last, she said, then you should understand why I don't trust you. I do. No, Herr Voss. You probably don't. The line remained open, but he sensed she was no longer speaking to the ministry employee. She was speaking to the idea of the state itself, to the years of letters, denials, sealed replies, and official condolences that had arrived with the neat cruelty of administrative grammar. Matthias sat very still. He did not interrupt. My husband died in September 1988, she said at last. That is what the newspapers wrote. It is what the officers told me. It is what the church said at the memorial. But 6 weeks later, I received a telephone call after midnight. No introduction, no explanation. A man asked whether my apartment windows were closed. I thought it was a prank. Then he told me Henrik had survived the impact and had been transferred. Not rescued, transferred. Those were his words. When I asked where, he said only, far enough that you cannot help him. Matthias felt the skin along his arms go cold. Did you report the call? He asked. A bitter breath escaped her. To whom? The police told me grief does strange things to memory. The military liaison officer visited 2 days later and said I was under strain. He brought flowers. He also brought a document reaffirming the official cause of death. After that, every time I asked questions, someone answered a different question instead. Matthias wrote quickly on a pad beside his keyboard. Midnight call, survived impact, transferred. Why ask about windows? I asked the same thing. Her voice lowered. The man said he didn't know what had followed them out of the cave. Then he hung up. Matthias stopped writing. For a moment he thought he had misheard her. The cave? Yes, but before he could press further, she withdrew. He could hear it happening in real time, like a door being carefully shut. I should not have said that, she murmured. Frau Neumann. No, if you are really looking, then you are already being watched. They watched me. They will watch you sooner, perhaps already. I only need to understand what happened. That is what another man said. Matthias's hand tightened on the pen. What man? This time, her hesitation felt different. Not fear of him, fear of memory. An officer, she said. Not high-ranking, not at first glance. Logistics or records, I think. He came to see me in 1992, 4 years after the crash. He did not wear a full dress uniform, only a dark overcoat and the posture of someone who still belonged to ordered rooms. He said there were irregularities in the casualty archive and asked whether Henrik had ever mentioned the Eifel region before his death. I asked him whether Henrik was alive. He did not answer directly. He just stared at the photograph on my mantle and said, "If he is, then the men above me will bury him twice." Matthias listened without moving. Did he give his name? Yes, but not one I trusted. A pause. Falk or Falk, something like that. What happened to him? The answer came immediately. He never returned. In the ministry annex, a heating pipe knocked once inside the wall behind Matthias's desk. The ordinary sound made the conversation seem stranger, not less. There it was. The first confirmation that this was not an isolated bureaucratic stain, but an old investigation aborted somewhere in its early stages. Someone else had seen the same fracture in the official story, and then stopped. Whether by caution, coercion, or disappearance, Clara did not know. Did he leave anything? Matthias asked. No letter, no report, but after he came, the postcards began. The postcards. Blank cards, she said. No message, no signature, just the postmark. Always from the same postal area in the Eifel. Sometimes one a year, sometimes none for 18 months. Then two close together. They always smell the same, like lightning after a storm. And something else, something mineral. Bitter. Ozone and sulfur, Matthias thought at once, though he did not say it aloud. Do you still have them? All of them. He stood up from his chair without realizing he had done so. May I see them? The old clock ticked on at her end. Then she said, if I say yes, you will come here. If you come here, the wrong people may follow. Matthias looked through the glass panel in his office door. Two junior staff members passed in the corridor carrying files. At the far end, Petra stood by the printer speaking to someone from procurement. No one looked toward him. Still, he no longer felt alone. Then meet me somewhere else, he said. Clara thought for a long time. Finally, she named a cafe near Euskirchen, off the main square, the kind of place where older people could sit for an hour over one coffee and never be remembered by the staff. Friday, 11 o'clock. Before ending the call, she added one last sentence. Bring nothing on ministry paper, and if anyone asks, you never found me. When the line went dead, Matthias remained standing, staring at the receiver in his hand. The room had lost its temperature, or perhaps his body had. A cave, not a crash site, not an air exercise. A cave. He replayed the words in order, survived the impact, transferred, what had followed them out of the cave. Whatever the original event had been, the helicopter crash now looked less like the beginning of the story than its official cover. He sat down and forced himself into sequence. Facts first, interpretations later. At 12:40, he left the annex and walked 3 blocks to a small second-hand bookstore cafe near the Alte Oper, a place with slow service, old lamps, and tables crowded by students who believed they were invisible. There, he unpacked a notebook he rarely used for anything official and began constructing a parallel timeline from scratch. September 1988, Bundeswehr helicopter crash near Baumholder. 12 dead, public narrative fixed. October 1988. Amended death certificates issued internally. Late 1988. Anonymous call to widow claiming Henrik Adler survived and was transferred after a cave operation. 991. Legal shielding appears around medical disbursements. 1992. Unknown officer named Falk or Falk investigates archival irregularities, asks about Eiffel connection, disappears from widow's life. After 1992, blank postcards begin arriving from Eiffel postal zone. Present day, one deceased soldier receives highly restricted immunosuppressant through disguised reimbursement route. The waitress set down his coffee. He thanked her absently and kept writing. If there had been an earlier internal inquiry, traces of it might remain not in military archives, those would be too obvious, but in expense claims, vehicle logs, personnel reimbursements, or records requests. Investigators, even discreet ones, left bureaucratic footprints simply by moving through institutions. Matthias had spent too long in government to believe anyone vanished cleanly. Back at the annex, he searched historical personnel databases through legacy identifiers that younger auditors no longer knew how to use. Names close to Falk or Falk produced dozens of entries. He narrowed them by ministry overlap, defense liaison clearance, and logistics background. By late afternoon, one profile stood apart. Major Rainer Falk, Bundeswehr Logistics Command. Temporary assignment, Archive Reconciliation Task Force, 1991-1993, status, deceased. Date of death, 7th of March, 1993, cause listed in the summary field, single vehicle accident on Bundesstraße 51 during heavy rain. Matthias stared at the screen. The entry was thin, almost aggressively thin. No pension follow-up attached, no family notation, no scanned attachments, just a death summary and a closed personnel tag. He requested the accident file through a Federal Transport Archive interface. Access denied. He tried again using an older route keyed through insurance litigation records. One page opened before the permission system caught up. Black sedan, roadside embankment, driver found dead at scene, and one line halfway down the first page made Matthias lean closer. No evidence of pre-impact braking. He copied the line by hand just as the page vanished behind a red restriction banner. No braking. He sat back slowly. A widow had asked questions and been neutralized with pity. An officer had noticed discrepancies and died on a wet road before he could return. The same region kept resurfacing: the Eifel, the old military ground, the blank postcards, the sealed pharmacy route. This was no longer a private anomaly hidden in a financial ledger. It was a corridor of erased attention stretching back more than 3 decades. Someone else had looked. Someone else had come close enough to frighten them. At 17:10, Petra appeared again, this time not bothering with pretext. "Your private account freeze," she said quietly from the doorway. "Did that happen before or after the meeting upstairs?" Matthias looked up sharply. "How do you know about that?" "Because payroll flagged a compliance lock with no originating fraud notice. That should not happen." She stepped inside and lowered her voice further. "Matthias, this is bigger than a bad ministry habit. You know that now, yes?" He nodded once. Petra studied the notebook on his desk. "Then hear me carefully. If someone was already pulling on this thread in the 90s and ended up dead, whatever you think this is, it is older and more protected than you assumed." She turned to go, then stopped with her hand on the frame. "And one more thing. Someone from Defense Records called downstairs looking for your paper archive requests from today. Not digital, paper. They asked specifically whether you had reviewed any accident files connected to Major Rainer Falk." Matthias felt his pulse rise, steady and hard. "Did you tell them?" Petra met his eyes. "I told them the records room flooded last winter and half the old request slips are unreadable." Then she left him alone with the monitor, the notebook, and the growing certainty that the mystery had not widened by accident. It had widened because someone, somewhere, was still actively guarding its edges. And now they knew exactly which dead officer Matthias had found. Friday arrived under a sky the color of old zinc. Matthias left Frankfurt before dawn, taking the A3 west and then turning south through roads that gradually shed the vocabulary of finance and entered a harsher, quieter grammar of forest, basalt, and weather. The city loosened its grip in stages. Glass towers gave way to logistics depots to bare fields, fields to long slopes cut by dark stands of spruce and beech. By the time he reached the outer roads near Euskirchen, the air itself seemed thinner, metallic with recent rain. Low clouds dragged over the hills. Farmhouses sat back from the lanes with their windows lit against the grey. It was a landscape built not for spectacle, but for endurance. He had told Sabine only that he was following up an irregular witness lead related to the audit. She had stood in the kitchen with one hand on the back of a chair, listening without interrupting, and then asked the only question that mattered. "Will you come back tonight?" Yes, he had said. It was not a promise he could fully measure. The cafe Clara Neumann had chosen stood on a side street just off the square, beneath an old sandstone facade weathered to a dull brown. Its windows were steamed at the corners. Inside, the room smelled of coffee, apple cake, and damp coats. A radio murmured somewhere behind the counter. 2 pensioners sat over newspapers near the door. A woman in a wool hat stirred tea without drinking it. Nothing in the room suggested danger. That was precisely why such places were useful. Matthias arrived 20 minutes early and chose a table in the rear, where he could see both the entrance and the street reflection in the glass of a framed print opposite him. He ordered coffee and did not touch it. Every time the door opened, cold air came in with a brief draft of wet stone and diesel from the street. At 11:07, Clara Neumann entered. She was smaller than he had imagined, perhaps in her late 70s now, with silver hair pulled back cleanly and the composed posture of a woman who had spent decades making herself difficult to read. Her coat was dark green, practical and well kept. She carried no handbag, only a worn leather document case tucked under one arm. Her face had the severity of someone who had been forced into patience and had never mistaken it for peace. She looked at him once, not searching for recognition, but confirmation, then crossed the room and sat opposite him without removing her coat. "You came alone," she said. "Yes." "That does not mean you were not followed." Matthias accepted the correction. "No, it doesn't." The waitress approached. Clara asked for black coffee and nothing else. When they were alone again, she placed the leather case on the table between them, but kept one hand resting lightly on it. For a moment, neither spoke. Up close, Matthias could see that age had not softened her features. It had refined them into something leaner and more controlled. Her eyes were pale grey, almost without colour, but alert in a way that made him think of long winters and locked drawers. "Before I show you anything," she said, "tell me what you know. Not what you suspect, what you know." Matthias told her. He did not dramatize the findings. He listed them as facts. The agricultural subsidy fund used as a shell account, the 12 medical stipends, the 1988 helicopter crash, the amended death certificates, the recent prescription for an unreleased immunosuppressant collected near a restricted zone, the facility-shaped pattern in the disbursements, Major Rainer Falk and the thin accident file, his own account freeze. Clara listened with her hands folded, her face still. Only once did she react, at the mention of the immunosuppressant. A faint tension moved through her mouth, then disappeared. "Then they are still being treated," she said quietly. "That is what the money suggests." She gave a short nod, as if confirming something long dreaded rather than learning something new. Then she opened the document case. Inside were 2 bundles tied with grey ribbon, several loose envelopes, and a stack of postcards wrapped in wax paper that had yellowed at the folds. She unwrapped them carefully, with the gesture of someone handling evidence from her own life. "These first," she said. She slid the postcards across the table. They were ordinary at first glance. Tourist prints, forest roads, a ruined watchtower, a river bend under snow, a photograph of a deer at the edge of pines, no messages, no signatures, no handwriting except for her address, always typed on an old mechanical label strip. The postmarks came from different sub-offices over the years, but all within the same regional radius in the Eifel. Matthias lifted one and brought it close. The smell was faint but unmistakable. Ozone, and beneath it, something harsher, mineral and sulphurous, as if the card had spent time in air that did not circulate properly. "They arrive without pattern?" he asked. "Without visible pattern," Clara corrected. "I once thought they came on anniversaries, then I thought perhaps after storms. Later I gave up trying to make them kind." He turned over another card, same blank back, same typed address. The paper had absorbed the smell into its fibers. "Did you ever tell anyone about them? A local policeman, in the beginning?" He suggested a cruel joke. "Later I showed one to a military archivist in Koblenz, who seemed sympathetic until he became frightened by his own sympathy. After that, no." She held his eyes. "You are the first person I have shown the full set." There were 31 postcards in total. 31 silent proofs that someone, somewhere, had remembered her existence without ever daring to write a word. The waitress brought Clara's coffee. Neither of them touched theirs. "There is more," Clara said. From the second bundle, she removed a long envelope, brittle at the corners, and slid out a folded carbon copy letter dated 14th of November 1992. The signature was missing, cut cleanly from the bottom edge, but the body remained. Matthias unfolded it with great care. "Frau Adler, I am writing instead of visiting because I am no longer certain which offices are safe to speak in. Your husband's file is not consistent across departments. There are transfers recorded after his legal death. There are sealed medical authorizations without originating diagnoses. I believe the public story attached to the September 1988 incident was constructed after the fact, though I cannot yet prove by whom. If I can confirm the supply route, I will return. There is one location that appears repeatedly where it should not. An old logistics corridor in the northern Eifel, near decommissioned NATO infrastructure. The records are disguised under agricultural and environmental headings. If anyone contacts you claiming the matter has been settled, assume the opposite. Do not trust condolences delivered too neatly." The page ended there, the missing signature line leaving behind only fibers where the name had once been. "Falk," Matthias said. Clara nodded. "He gave it to you in person?" "No, it was in my letterbox 2 days after he last visited. I removed his name myself after the police told me he had died in a road accident. I did not know who might search my house." Matthias read the letter again. Old logistics corridor, decommissioned NATO infrastructure, agricultural and environmental headings. The phrases aligned too precisely with the financial architecture he had been tracing. The agricultural fund, the environmental procurement labels, the hidden facility. Falk had reached the same threshold more than 30 years earlier. Did Henrik ever mention the Eiffel before 1988? Matthias asked. Clara stared into her coffee, though she still had not touched it. Only once, and not by name. It was in August that year. He was restless, distracted. We were still newly married. He had always been able to leave military tension outside the apartment. But that month, he began waking in the night as if he had heard something underground. She stopped, then corrected herself. No, not heard, felt, that is how he described it, as if some vibration had entered the bones first and only later become sound. Matthias wrote the phrase down at once. What exactly did he say? She closed her eyes briefly, summoning an old room. He said they had been assigned to support extraction work in a place that should have remained sealed. I thought he meant munitions, old fuel, maybe collapsed tunnels. I asked if it was dangerous. He told me danger was too ordinary a word for it. Then he laughed, but the laugh was wrong. He said, if anyone asks, we were never there, not even on paper. The cafe seemed suddenly smaller. Around them spoons touched porcelain. A door opened and closed. Someone coughed into a scarf. The ordinary world persisted, but it now felt like wallpaper over reinforced concrete. Did he mention what had to be extracted? No. Only that something had been found in a cave system connected to older military surveys. Something biological, perhaps. Or perhaps he wanted me to think it was biological because the truth sounded worse. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup. After his death, or whatever word should replace it, I tried for years to decide whether the postcards meant comfort or warning. I still don't know. Matthias was about to ask another question when something in the stack of postcards caught his eye. One card, older than the others, had been bent slightly at one corner. Not enough to notice at first glance. Just enough to suggest it had once concealed or marked something. He picked it up carefully and tilted it toward the window. Along the glossy image of a forest road, there was a faint rectangular shadow on the front, almost invisible unless the light caught it sideways. Was something attached here once? He asked. Clara frowned. I never noticed. Matthias ran a thumb lightly over the spot. The surface had a different texture, a residue from dried adhesive. May I? At her nod, he lifted the postcard closer to the table lamp mounted on the wall beside them. On the back, under the typed address strip, the paper had a tiny bulge where a second layer had separated from the card stock. Very gently, using the edge of a sugar packet knife, he eased up one corner. A thin paper insert slid out from inside the postcard itself. Clara inhaled sharply. The hidden slip was no larger than a train ticket, folded twice and stained at the edges. Matthias unfolded it with a care that made his fingertips ache. Inside was a photocopied fragment of what looked like a supply manifest. Most of the page had been cut away, leaving only a few lines readable. Containment membrane seals, Type 4 ventilation baffles, subterranean unit delivery route. Eiffel Nord Wildlife Sector, receiving kill A12, amber transfer. At the bottom, half obscured by the cut, was a date. March 1993. The same month, Major Rainer Falk died. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Clara whispered, almost to herself, "He was trying to tell me where they had taken them." Matthias felt something shift inside the architecture of the case. Not merely a new clue, but a change of direction. Wildlife Sector. That was the kind of label governments used when they wanted a road to lead nowhere interesting. A preservation zone, an environmental buffer, a restricted habitat. Civilian language wrapping military exclusion. He read the lines again. Receiving code A12. 12 subjects, 12 stipends, 12 dead men maintained as if they were inventory that could neither be released nor acknowledged. "Do you have any other hidden inserts?" he asked. Clara shook her head slowly. "If I did, I never found them." He wanted to examine every card under magnification. He wanted to photograph the manifest fragment, compare the procurement language, trace the vendor codes, identify the wildlife sector designation. More than that, he wanted to know why Falk had hidden the paper this way instead of delivering it openly. Then he already knew, because by March 1993, he had realized that carrying evidence openly was how men ended up dead on wet roads without any sign of breaking. Matthias slipped the fragment into a clean receipt envelope from his pocket and sealed it. "This changes things," he said. Clara looked at him across the table. Her expression did not brighten. It darkened with vindication. "No," she said quietly, "it confirms them." When they rose to leave, the sky outside had sunk lower and the first cold droplets of new rain were stippling the pavement. Matthias offered to walk her to her car. She refused. At the door she paused and turned back once. "If you go into those hills," she said, "do not trust signs about conservation or research. In this country we hide our harshest places behind decent words." Then she stepped out into the weather and was gone. Matthias remained inside for a moment with the sealed envelope in his pocket, the odor of old postcards still clinging faintly to his hands. The supply fragment had done what no database could. It had given the mystery a physical direction, not just the Eiffel, not just decommissioned military ground. A specific mask, a wildlife sector, and a receiving code tied to all 12 men. By the time he reached his car, the rain had strengthened there. Fine and slanting across the square, he unlocked the driver's door, slid in, and placed the envelope carefully inside his briefcase. Only then did he notice the folded sheet tucked beneath his windshield wiper. Plain white paper, no envelope. He stepped back into the rain and unfolded it. There was only one sentence, typed in narrow black letters. "Retirement is a kinder burial than discovery." By the time Matthias reached Frankfurt again, the note from the windshield wiper had dried into a harder, flatter thing inside his briefcase, as if paper could absorb intent. "Retirement is a kinder burial than discovery." The sentence had no signature, no official mark, no threat explicit enough to quote in a complaint. That was what made it effective. It belonged to the same grammar as frozen accounts and sealed files. Deniable, measured, designed not to alarm the police, but to enter the bloodstream of a life. It did not need to explain itself. It assumed he would understand. He did. The Autobahn East was slick under evening rain. Headlights broke and reformed in the wet surface like damaged film. Trucks moved through the dark in disciplined columns. Matthias drove with both hands fixed to the wheel and the heating turned low, listening for changes in the car he would once have ignored. A tremor in the pedals, a softness in the steering, the faintest delay when he pressed the brake on the descending ramps. Each sound now arrived burdened with possibility. At a service area outside Limburg, he pulled in beneath fluorescent canopies and stepped out into air sharp with diesel, coffee, and wet asphalt. He walked once around the car, crouched by each wheel, opened the bonnet without really needing to. He was not a mechanic, but he knew enough to recognize how quickly ordinary trust could be removed from ordinary objects. Everything looked normal. That no longer meant very much. He reached Frankfurt after 8. Sabina was waiting in the kitchen with one lamp on and the rest of the apartment dark. The way she did when she wanted the room to remain calm, regardless of what entered it. A casserole dish sat untouched on the stove. 2 plates had been laid out. She looked at him only once before noticing the fatigue in his face and the rain still beaded on his coat. "So," she said, "it was not a routine witness meeting." He took off the coat slowly. "No. Did you at least eat? Coffee?" Sabine closed her eyes for a brief second, not in theatrical despair, but in the private exhaustion of someone who has long understood that concern alone changes nothing. "Sit," she said, "and start from the beginning." He did. Not every detail, not yet. But enough. Clara Neumann. The postcards, the hidden paper slip, Major Falk's 1992 letter, the phrase about a cave, the wildlife sector cover, the receiving code tied to 12 maintained cases, and finally the note left on the car. Sabine listened in complete stillness, her hands folded loosely near the salt cellar as if she had set them there to keep from interrupting. Outside the kitchen windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. Somewhere upstairs, a chair scraped across a floor. Their building smelled faintly of cooked onions and detergent, the ordinary domestic odors of other lives proceeding on schedule. When Matthias finished, Sabine did not speak immediately. She stood, went to the counter, and ladled food onto both plates. Only when she had sat again did she say, "You should stop now." He had expected the words. Their bluntness still hurt. "You know I can't." "No," she said, "that is what you tell yourself because the alternative feels like cowardice. But there is a difference between courage and obedience to your own worst reflex." Matthias looked down at the plate, though he had no appetite. They are keeping 12 men hidden on public money. If they are alive, their families were lied to. If they are ill, then something happened that was buried under a false crash report. "And if you continue," Sabine asked, "what happens then? To them, to you, to us?" The question did what the note on the windshield could not. It moved the danger from abstraction into the room. He thought of the frozen accounts, the mortgage transfer delayed, the way such interference could widen by increments until daily life itself became an instrument. A tax review, an insurance complication, a pension dispute timed to last months. The state, when it wished to discourage, rarely had to invent new weapons. It simply misused the old ones. Sabine saw the thought in his face. "I am not asking you to be indifferent," she said more quietly. "I am asking you to recognize that people with power can survive scandal better than ordinary people can survive being made examples of." Matthias said nothing. She reached into the drawer by the bread box and placed a small bank receipt beside his plate. "The grocery card failed this afternoon," she said. "Then the pharmacy direct debit was rejected. I went to the bank. They said there is a compliance hold. Temporary, they called it. As if that word makes humiliation sterile." A dull heat rose in his chest. He had known it would touch her. Knowing was not the same as seeing the evidence placed beside the dinner plate. "I'm sorry," he said. Sabine's expression changed then, not softened but sharpened by pain. "Do not apologize as if you were late home from work. Either stop this or admit that you are asking me to pay for your conscience with you." He looked at her and saw not opposition, but fear stripped of ceremony. They had built a life of routines because routines had once been the answer to chaos. Their daughter grown, their finances careful, their retirement close enough to speak of in concrete months instead of vague someday language. And now, within 48 hours, pressure had entered the apartment through the banking system, through timing, through silence. For the first time since the Amber Alert appeared on his screen, Matthias felt ashamed, not of the investigation, of how naturally he had assumed he alone would bear it. That night he slept badly and woke twice to the sound of rain gutters draining outside. At 04:30, he gave up and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, reconstructing the procurement language from the hidden slip in Clara's postcard. Containment membrane seals, ventilation baffles, subterranean unit, Eiffel Nord wildlife sector. Amber transfer. The phrase amber transfer stayed with him, not deep amber. He had not found that formulation anywhere yet. Just amber transfer, as if what he was seeing were a logistical fragment of a larger codename structure. At 07:15, he left for the annex under a sky washed almost white with cloud. The building felt different the moment he entered. No overt hostility, no dramatic confrontation, but certain kinds of pressure altered air. The receptionist looked up too quickly and then away. A security guard near the lift checked Matthias's badge twice, although he had never done so before. In the corridor outside the audit division, two unfamiliar men in dark civilian jackets stood speaking with a deputy director from compliance. They stopped when Matthias approached. He walked past them without acknowledging their existence. At his desk, the restrictions had multiplied. His access to 3 financial routing tools was suspended pending system review. 2 archived export folders had vanished from the network entirely, including a backup directory he had not opened in months. A formal notice waited in his inbox, requesting his presence at 10 o'clock before the Internal Oversight Committee for examination of unauthorized cross-jurisdictional inquiry behavior. Examination, not meeting, not review. The language was already hardening. Petra appeared beside his desk, carrying a mug she did not seem to know she was holding. "They have been in the records room since 7, she said under her breath. 2 from internal security, 1 from defense liaison. Looking for what? Whatever they can claim should not exist." She glanced toward the corridor. "Matthias, tell me you took the postcard fragment off-site." "I did." "Good." He stood. "Come with me." She frowned but followed him into a small document prep room where the hum of the binding machine gave them cover. There, in as few words as possible, he told her the essentials: the widow, the hidden insert, the 1992 letter, the wildlife sector lead. Petra listened with her back to the counter, her jaw slowly tightening. "A sealed biological support facility hidden under environmental procurement," she said at last, "using civilian agricultural accounting to spread the cost across dead systems no one audits properly. That is my reading. And you think the 12 dead soldiers are inside it? I think the money is." Petra exhaled through her nose. "Do you hear yourself?" "Constantly." She almost smiled, but the expression failed halfway. "Then hear this. They are not going to let you stroll into retirement with a farewell pen and a commemorative speech after you have touched something like this." "I know." "No," she said with a sudden edge. "You still know it abstractly. That is dangerous." Before he could answer, the phone in the prep room rang. Both of them looked at it. No one called that line directly. Matthias picked up. "Voss." A man's voice, calm and official, said, "Your wife should avoid using the pharmacy on Schweizerstrasse for a few days. Their systems are experiencing identity mismatches. Such errors can be upsetting for older people." The line went dead. For a second, Matthias simply stood there with the receiver at his ear, unable to move. Petra read his face. "What happened?" He replaced the handset very carefully. "They called about Sabine." Petra went pale. "Directly?" He nodded once. The room seemed suddenly too small, the air overused. Now the pressure had crossed the final line. Not frozen accounts, not internal notices, not clever wording on white paper. They had spoken her name without speaking it. They had placed their hand, politely and unmistakably, on his private life. At 10 o'clock, Matthias entered the oversight room on the 5th floor. 3 officials sat behind a narrow table. 1 from Ministry Compliance, 1 from Legal Affairs. The third he recognized at once from the earlier meeting, the thinner defense representative with the controlled face and the discreet tie pin. The room had a single window this time, but the blinds were closed. Questions followed. Why had he continued inquiry after preliminary classification notice? Why had he contacted a private citizen connected to a sealed military matter? Why had he duplicated investigative notes off-system? Why had he failed to report possible exposure to restricted national security material? The questions were structured not to learn, but to establish procedural guilt in layers. Each answer, however careful, could be repositioned later as non-compliance. Matthias responded as narrowly as he could. Public financial irregularity, audit necessity, civilian expenditure chain. No classified conclusions reached. He could feel the structure closing around him and recognized it for what it was, the preparation of an internal case file that would justify whatever came next. Then the defense representative leaned forward slightly and asked in the mild tone of someone requesting an umbrella back after a meeting, "Where is the physical fragment removed from the postcard?" Matthias met his eyes. "I don't know what you mean." The man held the gaze for a moment too long. "You will." After the session ended, Matthias returned to his office to find 2 security employees standing outside his door, while a third inventoried the contents of his desk drawers. Their authority documents were in order. Temporary seizure of ministry materials for chain of custody review. He watched in silence as they removed notebooks, request slips, old printouts, and even his spare reading glasses from the top drawer before someone decided the glasses were not evidence and set them aside again. One of the officers, a young man with apologetic eyes, said quietly, "We are instructed to do this thoroughly, Herr Voss." "Yes," Matthias replied. "That is usually how institutions humiliate people." The young man looked down and said nothing. By late afternoon, word had spread through the floor in the discreet, efficient manner of all office rumor. Conversations paused when Matthias passed. Doors remained half open, as if openness itself could serve as self-protection. No one was openly hostile. That would have required conviction. What he saw instead was worse, fear seeking distance. At 17:30, Petra came to his office with her coat on. "I checked your car in the garage," she said without preamble. "Come now." They went down together to the underground parking level where the concrete held the day's cold and each footstep returned in a hollow echo. Matthias's car sat in its usual space under a strip light that flickered at one end. Petra crouched beside the front wheel and pointed. At first he saw nothing. Then the detail resolved. A fine wet sheen traced one line of the brake hose fitting. Not much, barely visible unless one knew where to look. "Fluid," Petra said. "Maybe old, maybe not. But I would not drive this another kilometer." Matthias stood very still. He thought of the rain-dark autobahn the previous night, the long downhill exits, the service station where he had circled the car like a nervous amateur and found nothing. A minor defect, perhaps, or something less innocent, introduced just carefully enough that a future accident could be filed under age, weather and fatigue. Petra rose and wiped her fingers on a tissue. "I'm calling a tow service, I trust, not the ministry contractor." For once Matthias did not argue. They stood in the cold garage beside the compromised car, listening to the distant hum of ventilation fans. Somewhere above them, within floors of glass and carpet and compliance language, his professional life was being quietly dismantled. At home, Sabine was now part of the pressure system, whether she consented or not. And beneath all of it, under wildlife cover and agricultural headings, something in the Eifel continued to consume public money, medical supplies and secrecy with the patience of a buried machine. When Petra finished the call, she looked at him for a long moment. "They are telling you to stop," she said. Matthias stared at the thin, glistening line on the brake fitting. "No," he answered. "They are telling me I'm close." At that moment, his phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. No greeting, no explanation. Only a set of coordinates, a time for the following evening, and one sentence beneath them. "If you want to know what amber really means, come alone." The coordinates led to a service road above the main. On the eastern edge of Frankfurt, where the city's polished surfaces gave way to warehouses, rail yards, and the blunt practical geometry of utility land. Matthias arrived 20 minutes early and parked where the road widened near a chain-link fence half swallowed by winter weeds. It was Saturday evening. The light had already begun to thin, not into darkness yet, but into that colorless hour in which everything industrial seemed older than it was. Freight trains moved in the distance with low metallic thunder. Beyond the river, cranes stood still against the pale sky. The air smelled faintly of wet gravel, cold water and diesel from somewhere beyond sight. He had not told Sabine where he was going. That omission sat badly with him all the way from the apartment. It was not simply deception. It was a surrender to the logic of the investigation, the first clear moment when he chose secrecy at home for the sake of movement outside it. Sabine had spent the day speaking as little as possible, which was always more troubling than anger. Before he left, she had asked only whether he intended to keep going. He had said yes. She had nodded once, not in support but in comprehension, and turned back to the kitchen window. Now, standing outside his car in the failing light, Matthias checked the road again. No traffic, no pedestrians, no obvious surveillance van, though after the last 48 hours, he no longer trusted his own ability to separate caution from contamination. He kept his scarf high against the cold and listened. In quiet places like this, the city became an animal breathing somewhere below the ground. At 17:42, headlights appeared around the bend. A dark station wagon approached slowly, then stopped 10 meters ahead of him without switching off its engine. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was in his early 60s, perhaps a little older, with a broad forehead, a blunt nose, and the compact posture of someone whose body had once belonged to military habit and had only partially retired from it. He wore a dark field jacket instead of a proper overcoat and moved with a slight stiffness in his left leg. Not dramatic, just enough to suggest an old injury that had long ago stopped asking permission. He did not come closer immediately. "Herr Voss," he said, his voice carried without effort. "You asked me to come alone," Matthias replied. "Did you?" "Yes." The man looked once toward the road behind Matthias, once toward the railway embankment, then gave the smallest nod. "That will have to do." He came forward and stopped within arm's length. Up close, his face seemed less severe than worn, not the weariness of age, but of long-standing compromise. "My name is Thomas Reiner," he said. "At least, that is the name I have used since 1998. Before that, records would place me in logistics support under the Ministry of Defense, temporary liaison assignments, special transport authorizations, mostly the kind of work no one remembers until it goes wrong." Matthias said nothing. He had learned that the first version of a truth often arrived only if not interrupted. Reiner glanced toward the river and continued. "I knew Reiner Falk, not well enough to recognize when he began asking the wrong questions in rooms that had trained themselves not to hear. I also know what happened in the Eifel in 1988. Or rather, I know the portion that can be spoken without sounding insane. The word was chosen deliberately. Not impossible, not classified. Insane. It sharpened the air between them. "Then speak plainly," Matthias said. Reiner looked at him for several seconds, as if judging whether plain speech would survive the journey from one man to another without breaking under its own weight. "There was no ordinary crash," he said at last. "There was a staged crash site. That much you already understand. The helicopter did fly that day, but not with 12 dead men on board when it went down. The fire was real. The wreckage was real. The bodies were another matter. The public needed a coherent event. The ministries needed legal closure, so they built one." Matthias felt his chest tighten, not with surprise, but with the cold physical sensation that came when a hypothesis crossed into witness territory. What were the soldiers doing before that? Reiner's gaze shifted slightly, no longer on Matthias, but on something 38 years behind him. "Extraction support," he said. Officially, it was an old site hazard recovery exercise tied to legacy NATO infrastructure. Unofficially, a survey team had opened a sealed cave system connected to a Cold War storage mapping corridor in the northern Eifel. Something had been detected below that did not fit the geological reports. Heat anomalies, air chemistry disruptions, repeated equipment failures. Then one of the civilian scientists assigned to the first descent became violently ill and died within 36 hours. The army was asked to secure the site before the matter became visible outside the chain of command. Henrik Adler's unit was part of the transport and perimeter team. Matthias heard again Clara's remembered phrase, "Danger was too ordinary a word for it." "What did they find?" he asked. Reiner gave a short, humorless breath. "That depends on which office was writing the report. Fungal bloom, unknown extremophile colony, pre-industrial biofilm disturbed by military blasting in the 60s. Cave gas carrying mutagenic contaminants, reservoir organism from older waste burial. Pick the language that lets the budget proceed." He looked back at Matthias. The truth is that no one ever agreed on the mechanism, only on the result. Exposure produced progressive systemic collapse in some personnel and something else in others. Tissue inflammation, blood anomalies, neurological disruption, periods of lucidity alternating with confusion, violent immune overreaction. Then, in a few cases, stabilization, not recovery. Stabilization. The wind moved lightly through the weeds at the roadside. A freight horn sounded somewhere far off, long and low. And the 12 soldiers? Contaminated, Reiner said, or believed to be. Enough that the ministries decided they could not be returned, examined publicly, or entered into any ordinary medical system. Too many eyes, too many liabilities. Some men in that chain believed they were protecting the public. Others were protecting careers. After a week, those motives became impossible to separate. Matthias looked down at the wet gravel between them. For days he had pursued the numbers as if they would remain numbers long enough for him to keep a professional distance. But now the matter had a texture beyond accounting. Men in transport uniforms coughing blood in sealed rooms, officers deciding that false funerals were administratively simpler than uncontrolled truth, widows being handed flowers while their husbands were moved underground into state-funded erasure. "Why contact me now?" he asked. Reiner's expression changed. For the first time, Matthias saw something like shame pass across it. "Because they are still there," he said, "and because I spent years helping the machinery continue." The admission hung between them without softness. "What was your role?" "Supply routing, reclassification, civilian budget masking after defense appropriations became too visible. In the 90s, when the Cold War ended and certain black budgets became harder to bury under NATO language, parts of the project were moved into agricultural remediation, environmental hazard management, and later public health contingency accounts. That is why you found it where you did. Dead funds are quiet." Matthias thought of the obscure subsidy account, the agricultural shell, the dull spreadsheet cells that had first exposed the lie, buried in plain sight. Exactly as the opening rhythm of his days had always warned him secrets would be. "And Falk?" Reiner lowered his eyes briefly. He was assigned to reconcile old transport records after a digitization review uncovered inconsistencies. He was not meant to investigate, but he had the dangerous habit of reading one file too far. Once he realized that post-mortem transfer authorizations existed for the men from the crash, he began tracing vehicle manifests into the Eifel. "He came to me twice. The first time I told him nothing. The second time I told him enough to make him think he could prove it. And then he died." Reiner nodded once. "His car left the road in rain on the B-51. That is the official version. I never saw an order to kill him. Men in our world rarely did. What we saw were conditions arranged so that certain outcomes became easier. A delayed repair, a changed duty route, a missing escort, an assumption that weather would finish what policy had begun." Matthias said quietly, "That sounds like murder described by accountants." Reiner accepted the sentence without defense. "Yes." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The last natural light had thinned further now, leaving the road and fence line washed in a color close to ash. Reiner reached into his jacket and produced a folded plastic sleeve. Inside were photocopied pages, old enough that the toner had softened at the edges. He handed them over. "I could not keep originals," he said. "These were made years ago. They are incomplete, but enough to show the shape." Matthias opened the sleeve carefully. The first page was a transport manifest. Not civilian, military internal. 3 vehicles, no personnel names, route designation scrubbed, but one destination field remained partially visible under poor redaction. Object A12, Eifel Nord. The second page appeared to be part of a medical review summary. He read only fragments at first. Persistent immunological instability, containment continuity essential, external release not recommended under any civilian protocol. Then a line on the third page stopped him cold. Family contact permanently contraindicated. He looked up. They decided the families could never know. They decided contact introduced risk, Reiner said. Psychological destabilization, operational leakage, chain exposure. Again, choose your preferred bureaucratic sin. Matthias turned to the last page. Unlike the others, it was handwritten. A note, perhaps copied from a meeting file or dictated summary. The handwriting was angular, hurried, and deeply familiar in tone, even though he had never seen it before. If condition progresses beyond containment, transfer to amber depth protocol. Matthias read the line twice. Amber depth, he said. Reiner watched him carefully. That is the phrase you need to understand. Amber was never only a medical quarantine. It became a layered system. Amber transfer moved exposed personnel. Amber holding managed them. Amber depth referred to what lay below the official facility, the part only a few of us ever saw on paper. A colder current seemed to pass through Matthias than the evening air could account for. Below, the wildlife center is cover, Reiner said. The bunker beneath it is real, but even the bunker is not the original site. There are deeper levels connected to sealed cave structures used before the Bundeswehr ever touched them. Old mapping tunnels, NATO modifications, geological voids no ministry fully controlled once the contamination narrative took hold. The men in A12 were not simply hidden because they were sick. They were kept there because whatever affected them was believed to remain active in the substrate beneath the facility. Matthias felt absurdly as if the earth itself had entered the conversation. Not a metaphor now, not an abstract cave in an old widow's memory. A physical underworld beneath the cover story, beneath the budget, beneath the bunker. Something still present enough to dictate logistics, medicine, and secrecy across 4 decades. "Why give this to me?" he asked again, softer this time. Reiner's answer came immediately. "Because I am dying." The sentence was not theatrical. It was administrative in its finality. "Pancreas," Reiner added. "A few months, perhaps less. There are things one can carry into death, and things one should not. I no longer know whether this belongs to guilt or duty. Perhaps both." Matthias looked back at the pages in his hand. This was the ally he had not expected. Not heroic, not clean, not free of complicity. A man who had spent years oiling the machinery and had now arrived too late for innocence. Which made him useful. It also made him uncertain. Because if Reiner had served the system for decades, how much of what he offered was truth? And how much was another managed corridor designed to guide Matthias toward a safer lie? The doubt must have crossed his face, because Reiner said, "You should not trust me entirely, that would be foolish. But you should trust the documents, the route codes, and the fact that if they knew I was here, I would not drive home." A train passed behind the embankment then, its noise filling the road with iron thunder for several seconds. When it had gone, the silence seemed altered. Reiner took one step backward. "There is one more thing," he said. "What?" "One of the 12 is not merely alive. He asked about his wife for years, until they sedated the asking out of him." Matthias thought at once of Clara Neumann and the 31 blank postcards smelling faintly of ozone and sulfur. "Henrik Adler," he said. Reiner did not answer directly. Instead, he said, "If you go into the Eifel, do not look first for military fencing. Look for environmental virtue, solar panels, educational signage, restricted bird habitats. Germany has learned to hide its worst rooms behind responsible language." He turned toward his car. Matthias took a step after him. "How do I find the site?" Reiner opened the driver's door but paused before getting in. "Supply trucks still need roads," he said, "and roads still need telecom coverage. Trace the relay dead zones around the wildlife center, permits in Eifel Nord. Where signals disappear too neatly, concrete usually begins." Then he added, without turning back, "And do not wait too long. They have already moved 2 of the 12. Before Matthias could ask where or why, Reiner got into the car and drove off into the deepening grey. Matthias remained by the fence with the copied pages in his hands and the sound of that last sentence still expanding inside him. They have already moved 2 of the 12. The mystery had become personal before. Now it had become unstable. Whatever Amber was, it was changing again. On Sunday morning, Frankfurt woke under a hard white sky that seemed to press the city flat. The light carried no warmth. It lay across the windows of the apartment and made every object appear more sharply itself. The bowl of keys on the side table, the thin crack in the kitchen tile near the radiator, the coffee spoon Sabine had left on the draining board the night before. Matthias stood at the window with Reiner's copies spread across the table behind him and watched 2 cyclists move along the street below in coats bright enough to defy the weather. For several seconds, he envied them the stupidity of ordinary plans. He had slept less than 2 hours, not because of fear alone. Fear was clean compared to what now occupied his mind. Fear could still be answered by retreat. What unsettled him was structural. For days, he had treated the cover-up as a terrible but legible act. 12 contaminated soldiers hidden by the state after an exposure event, kept alive in a subterranean facility because secrecy and public safety had fused into the same bureaucratic reflex. That story, grim as it was, still had a shape the mind could endure. But Reiner had cracked that shape open. Amber was not just a quarantine. Amber depth, deeper levels beneath the official bunker, a substrate still considered active. 2 of the 12 already moved. It meant the apparent explanation, the one Matthias had begun to construct with such disciplined care, was not the whole thing. Perhaps it had never been the central thing. The men were not simply hidden because they were victims of a sealed accident. They were part of a system that remained in motion, adapting, relocating, consuming money and silence because something below the cover story still dictated policy. His original belief had not been wrong. It had merely been too small. Sabine entered the kitchen without speaking and set down 2 cups of coffee. She was still in her robe, her hair not yet pinned, her face carrying the tired composure of someone who had been awake longer than she wanted to admit. For a moment, she said nothing, simply took in the spread of documents on the table. Photocopied manifests, route codes, handwritten notes in Matthias's careful script. The copied line about family contact being permanently contraindicated. Then her gaze settled on him. "You met someone," she said. It was not a question. Matthias nodded. "And now it is worse." "Yes." Sabine pulled out the chair opposite him and sat. The movement was slow, almost ceremonial, as if they had crossed into a kind of marriage in which truth had to be placed on the table deliberately or else rot inside the walls. He told her more than he had intended. Not every document, not the coordinates, not Petra's help, but enough. A former logistics officer, a staged crash site, the possibility that the 12 men had survived the original incident, a hidden bunker under environmental cover in the Eifel, and beneath that, perhaps, a deeper site no ordinary civilian authority had ever truly controlled. Sabine listened with both hands around the coffee cup. When he finished, she looked not shocked but profoundly tired. "Do you hear what you sound like now?" she asked. "Yes. Do you believe it?" Matthias stared down at the photocopied note. If condition progresses beyond containment, transfer to amber depth protocol. "I believe the documents," he said. "I believe the money. I believe the concealment. As for the rest, what exactly lies below, what they found, what is real and what was misinterpreted under fear, I don't know. But something underneath the official explanation is driving the entire system." Sabine was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That is the problem. Once people begin speaking about deeper levels and buried things and hidden sites beneath hidden sites, the world stops correcting them. It starts rewarding the story itself." Matthias knew what she meant. He had seen it in other cases. A narrow truth, once contaminated by scale, could become unusable because any sane listener instinctively recoiled from its architecture. He was now carrying a story that could be dismissed not because it was false, but because its true shape sounded like madness. That was the elegance of it. He drank his coffee cold and left for the office with the copies sealed in a plain brown envelope, hidden inside an old income tax manual in his briefcase. Sabine said nothing at the door, neither did he, but when he reached the stairwell, she called after him. "Matthias," he turned. "If you are no longer looking for justice," she said, "be honest enough to know what you are looking for instead." The words followed him all the way down to the street. At the annex, Sunday access required an additional security check. The lobby was nearly empty, the polished floor reflecting the pale light from the revolving doors. Weekend buildings had their own acoustics. Every footstep seemed like someone arriving too early for something unwelcome. Matthias signed in, received a temporary corridor override, and rode the lift up alone. He had hoped for stillness. Instead, he found Petra already in his office, coat still on, arms folded, her expression sharpened by concern and lack of sleep. "I was about to call the police," she said. "You overestimate my social value." "Not funny." He closed the door behind him. "Why are you here?" Petra glanced at the briefcase. "Because someone accessed municipal land use archives at 0612 from a defense-rooted credential and requested environmental permits for 3 wildlife preservation sites in the Eifel region. Then, the same credential tried to query telecom maintenance coverage around those sites. That is either a remarkable coincidence or someone else is following the same path you are. Matthias felt a chill move through him. Can you show me? Petra was already turning to his monitor. She had brought printed extracts, paper, not digital, as if instinct had finally caught up with the case. The permits were old on the surface and boring by design. Avian migration corridors, restricted breeding zones, groundwater sensitivity, protected bat habitat. Each site sounded like the kind of place where bureaucracy expected respect rather than curiosity. Two of them collapsed quickly under scrutiny. The access roads were too exposed. The budget allocations too small. The maintenance routes ordinary. The third site sat in a forested section of the northern Eifel, not far from a decommissioned NATO communication belt. Its public label was almost laughably wholesome. Eifel Nord Fauna Recovery Reserve, a wildlife preservation center with a small education annex, limited access, and ongoing habitat stabilization work funded jointly through federal environmental and rural development programs. Matthias studied the map. The reserve had more service infrastructure than its declared function required. Backup generator contracts, water filtration renewals, HVAC servicing under specialized industrial codes, subterranean drainage inspection exemptions. More telling still, telecom coverage in the surrounding grid showed a deliberate-looking fracture. Signal strength dipped cleanly across a narrow corridor that did not follow topography or ordinary tower shadow. Not a natural dead zone, a shielded one. Petra tapped the page. This is where your mystery is pointing, yes? It was, Matthias said. Now I'm not sure whether this is the site or the front door to something beneath it. Petra looked at him carefully. What changed? He hesitated, then he told her about Rainer. Not his name, not the meeting location, but the substance, the staged crash, the contaminated soldiers, the possibility that amber extended below the official bunker, the note about 2 of the 12 being moved. As he spoke, Petra's face lost color. That can't be the official explanation, she said at last. I know. No, I mean administratively, it can't be. The state can hide people. The state can bury money. But it cannot sustain a story this unstable for almost 40 years unless the people inside it stopped understanding it themselves. Matthias looked at her. That was it exactly. The apparent explanation had been morally monstrous but bureaucratically stable. Contaminated men hidden for public safety. Horrible, yes. Coherent, yes. But if amber now involved deeper unknowns, if the facility itself sat atop something still active, if even the operators no longer fully understood the hazard, then the secrecy was not only about concealment, it was also about incomprehension. Their original framework, quarantine, black budget, institutional cruelty, had collapsed into something worse. A machinery still functioning around a core it no longer controlled. The thought rearranged everything. Do you know what that means? Petra asked quietly. Say it. It means the men may not be the reason the site is still operating. She held his gaze. They may be only one of the things inside it. The sentence entered him with the weight of cold metal. Until that moment, he had still imagined the 12 soldiers as the center of the structure. The human justification for every expense line, every hidden supply convoy, every stitched-together lie. Now he saw another possibility. They were not the center. They were the perimeter. The costs, the containment systems, the telecommunications shielding, the water filtration, the environmental masking. All of it might be preserving not simply a group of long-buried men, but a boundary between those men and something lower, older or less understood beneath them. He sat down slowly. Across the room, the radiator clicked as it warmed. Outside, a tram bell sounded faintly from the boulevard. The office, in all its ordinary beige competence, seemed suddenly absurd. Budget chairs, paper trays, compliance notices, an entire republic of laminated procedure surrounding the possibility that somewhere under the Eiffel there was a sealed project whose official narrative no longer matched its operational reality. At 11:10, Matthias used an old regional planning interface to trace the service roads feeding the reserve. Petra cross-checked telecom maintenance records from archived invoices. Together, they identified a narrow supply route branching away from the public entrance, nominally restricted for groundwater protection vehicles only. Yet freight tolerances on the resurfacing contracts showed recent reinforcement well beyond what conservation vans would require. Heavy loads, regularly enough to justify maintenance. Then Petra found something else. A cluster of outgoing telecom service requests from the reserve over the last 18 months. Most were mundane: generator diagnostics, storm damage, line interference. But 3 were tagged urgent and routed to a regional relay contractor near dawn. Each coincided with special transport reimbursements in Matthias's financial chain. Dates. He checked them against the medical stipend pattern. 2 matched periods when the payment spiked far above baseline, exactly the sort of spike one might expect during relocation, intensified treatment, or emergency containment. And the most recent urgent telecom maintenance call had occurred 9 days earlier. The same week, one of the dead soldiers collected the experimental immunosuppressant. They moved someone recently, Matthias said. Petra nodded. Or something. He looked at her. Neither corrected the other. By mid-afternoon, the air in the office had become stale from concentration and too much coffee. Matthias stood by the window and looked out over Frankfurt. The cranes, the river, the financial towers, the tram lines. A city built on managed flows. Capital, information, regulation, trust. All the things that allowed modern life to pretend that buried systems remained buried because institutions said they were. His phone vibrated, a message from Sabine. Please call when you can. Nothing else. He called at once. She answered after 1 ring, but instead of speaking immediately, she let him hear the silence on her end. Not domestic, not street noise, but the deadened hush of an interior corridor. Where are you? He asked. At Lena's, she said. Their daughter lived in Wiesbaden with her husband and 2 children. Sabina almost never went there without planning. Why? Because someone came to the apartment. The room seemed to tilt very slightly. Who? A man in a dark coat. No identification at first. He asked whether you had been under unusual pressure. Said he was from a pensions compliance unit and wanted to help resolve the banking issue. Her voice stayed calm, which made every word more alarming. When I asked for his card, he smiled and said, "Your husband is confusing procedure with revelation." Then he looked at the postcards on the hallway table. Matthias felt his hand tighten around the phone. What postcards? The one Clara mailed after your meeting. It arrived this morning. Blank, of course. Same smell. I had left it there because I didn't know what else to do with it. He looked at it for a very long time, then said, "Some messages are kinda unread." Matthias closed his eyes. Clara had mailed another card already. Not later, not in months, the same morning after meeting him, which meant either she had been frightened into warning him, or events around the site had accelerated enough that silence no longer felt safe to her. Did he take it? Matthias asked. No, he left it where it was. Then he apologized for the disturbance and asked me to advise you not to drive into the hills. Matthias said nothing. Sabine's voice softened for the first time. Matthias, whatever you believed yesterday, believe this now. They are no longer trying to frighten you away with abstractions. They are positioning themselves around your life. When the call ended, he stood very still beside the window, the phone heavy in his hand. Petra watched him from the desk. What happened? He told her. She swore under her breath, a rare enough thing that it seemed to clear the air. Then you have no more time for internal procedure, she said. Either you step away entirely or you go there before they close whatever remains to be found. Matthias looked back at the maps, the freight tolerances, the dead telecom corridor, the reserve permit, the urgent maintenance overlaps. Before this morning, he had thought his task was to prove the existence of hidden survivors and expose the accounting lie that sustained them. Now that task looked almost naive. The lie was larger. The hidden truth was not a single fact waiting to be revealed, but a layered structure of deception built around something moving below the level of official explanation. His original belief had collapsed. In its place stood a harsher possibility that the government's tidy version of heroic medical quarantine, monstrous as it would be, was itself only the acceptable outer wall of a much darker uncertainty. And if that was true, then every day spent gathering one more elegant proof inside Frankfurt might simply be time granted to the people below to move the evidence again. At 16:38, Petra printed the regional grid, folded it into thirds, and slid it across the desk. "You know where to start now," she said. Matthias took the map. In the upper right margin, almost invisible until the paper bent, was a handwritten notation that had not come from any public archive. It was recent, dark ink, hurriedly added by someone who knew the sector personally. Old relay station still live beneath Tower Ridge. Military firewall bypass possible. He looked up sharply. "Where did this come from?" Petra's expression changed. "It wasn't there when I printed it," she said. The office fell silent around them. No one had entered the room. No one stood at the door. Yet the note was there, fresh enough that one corner of the ink still glistened under the fluorescent light. And beneath the line about the relay station, in smaller script, were 3 words that made Matthias's pulse stumble. "Before they move, Henrik." By the time Matthias left the annex, the winter light had already thinned into iron. Frankfurt after dark did not ease him anymore. For years, the city's order had reassured him. The rail timetables, the disciplined geometry of bridges, the offices emptying floor by floor with ritual precision. Now every clean surface seemed to reflect the same truth back at him. Systems were strongest when they convinced ordinary people that structure itself was a form of safety. He drove home through early evening traffic with the folded sector map on the passenger seat and Petra's impossible annotation burning in his mind. Old relay station still live beneath Tower Ridge. Military firewall bypass possible. Before they move Henrik. He had turned the paper over 3 times before leaving the office, checking for transfer marks, hidden carbon pressure, anything that might suggest a mundane explanation. There had been none. The ink was fresh. The handwriting was not Petra's. That left only disturbing choices. Someone had entered the room without being noticed, or someone had already learned how to place guidance inside his path with unnerving intimacy. Neither possibility brought comfort. At home, the apartment felt altered by absence. Sabina had not returned from Wiesbaden. A single lamp was on in the living room, left by her deliberate hand to prevent the space from feeling abandoned. Her note was on the kitchen table beneath the sugar bowl. "I am staying with Lena tonight. There is soup in the refrigerator. Please do not open the door to anyone you do not know." No accusation, no dramatic farewell. Just instruction, domestic and restrained, which made it harder to bear. Matthias stood for a long moment with the note in his hand, listening to the apartment settle around him. A pipe clicked in the wall. Somewhere in the courtyard, a gate shut with hollow force. The refrigerator motor hummed and stopped. These were the sounds of a life he had spent decades building into reliability, and now every sound seemed to ask whether it could still hold him. He poured the soup into a pot and never turned on the stove. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with the map, Reiner's photocopies, Clara's hidden manifest fragment, and a fresh legal pad. He wrote in columns, the old method he trusted when his thoughts began to outrun sequence. Known, 12 soldiers officially dead in 1988. Medical stipends continue through shell accounts. Recent prescription proves at least 1 active beneficiary. Wildlife reserve in Eifel linked to facility-level infrastructure. Telecom dead zone suggests shielding. Possible deeper site beneath official bunker. 2 of the 12 already moved. Clara receives postcards likely from Henrik or via internal conduit. Relay station may bypass military firewall. Unknown what exactly amber depth contains. Why movement now? Whether Henrik Adler is still alive and conscious. Whether state actors still control the site or merely administer it. Who wrote the note on Petra's map? Then, beneath both columns, he wrote the question Sabine had left him with that morning. If you are no longer looking for justice, be honest enough to know what you are looking for instead. He stared at the sentence for a long time. At first, the answer came wrapped in the professional language he had always used to protect himself from the moral mess of real consequences. Accountability, truth, lawful exposure. But those words had begun to sound too clean for what now lay before him. If he drove into the Eifel, bypassed a military firewall, accessed hidden project files, and handed them to the outside world, that would not be an audit. It would not be internal correction. It would be breach. Possibly treason, depending on which office wrote the summary. Possibly the end of his pension, his name, his peace. and whatever remained of Sabine's patience. It might also be futile. Governments did not collapse because one tired man found the wrong folder. They adapted, spun, narrowed, buried, reclassified. The most he might achieve was a scandal trimmed into acceptable language. Historical quarantine mismanagement, regrettable secrecy under Cold War conditions, lessons learned. And yet beneath that cynical probability, something smaller and more stubborn remained. Henrik Adler had a wife who had spent 38 years receiving blank postcards smelling of ozone and sulfur. Someone inside the system, first Falk, then perhaps Reiner, now perhaps an unknown hand in his own office, had tried at real cost to keep a path open. And if the note on Petra's map was genuine, then whatever was happening in the Eifel was happening now. Not as history, as motion. His phone rang at 2013. Unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then he answered, "Voss." For a second he heard only road noise and poor connection. Then Petra's voice came through, lower than usual. "Do not go into the office tomorrow." He straightened. "Where are you?" "In my car, driving nowhere useful." She exhaled sharply. "They suspended me from system access an hour ago. Officially for irregular archive handling. Unofficially because someone searched my apartment building's refuse bins this evening." Matthias closed his eyes. "I'm sorry. Please stop saying that to people whose lives are already being adjusted around you." The words were hard, but exhausted rather than cruel. After a pause, she added, "Listen carefully. Internal Oversight drafted a referral package this afternoon. They are turning your inquiry into an employee misconduct and classified material exposure case. Once Legal Affairs finishes wording it, they can seize your devices, restrict your travel, and initiate pension suspension pending investigation." The room seemed to narrow around him. How long? Maybe tomorrow. Maybe 48 hours. Not longer. Matthias looked at the map on the table. So this was the true timetable now. Not retirement in 4 months. Not committee review. Not internal remedy. A race between buried truth and official containment. "Petra," he said, "did you write anything on the map?" "No. And if you ask whether I believe you about the note, I do. At this point, I am willing to believe a great many things I would have mocked on Thursday." She was quiet for a second. "Are you going there?" He did not answer at once. She did not rescue him from the silence. At last he said, "Yes." Petra let out a breath that might have been anger or relief. "Then stop pretending this can be done carefully. You're past careful. Take cash. Leave your ministry phone behind. And if you find something real, something the public can understand, do not bring it back into the system." "Where should I bring it?" "To someone who publishes first and apologizes later." She hesitated. "I know a journalist in Cologne. Investigative desk, national reach, not easily frightened. I'll text a number from a burner when I can." After the call ended, Matthias sat in the growing silence and realized with surprising calm that the choice had already been made before Petra ever asked the question. Silence or continuing? That was the part of the structure he was living in now. If he stepped back, the ministries would not merely forget him. They would mark him. A nervous late career auditor who overreached and was corrected. A man who triggered compliance locks, frightened his wife, drew colleagues into procedural trouble, then retreated into retirement under administrative cloud. His life would narrow around the retreat until retreat itself became his final identity. And worse than humiliation was the knowledge of what silence would mean. Somewhere in the Eifel, perhaps that very night, 12 or 10, men continued to exist under the language of the dead, while something beneath them consumed containment budgets and dictated movement through sealed routes. Clara would continue receiving her blank postcards until those too stopped. Sabine would still have been threatened, only for nothing. No easy way back remained. The realization did not arrive heroically. It arrived like fatigue settling into bone. At 21:05, he called Sabine. She answered on the third ring. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Lena made too much tea. The children think I am on holiday." He heard the softness in her voice when she mentioned the children, then the careful flattening when she returned to him. What happened? He told her the truth, or enough of it. Petra suspended, legal referral imminent, possible seizure orders, likely travel restrictions within days. He did not tell her everything about Amber Depth, because some truths were already too large to place gently into a tired evening phone call. Sabine listened in silence. Then she asked, very quietly, "Are you calling to warn me or to say goodbye to the ordinary version of yourself?" The question struck with almost physical force. Matthias looked at the dark kitchen window where his reflection floated faintly over the interior light. "Perhaps both," he said. A long pause followed. When Sabine spoke again, her voice had changed. Still hurt, but steadier, as if she had crossed her own internal threshold and no longer intended to waste strength on denial. "Then hear me now, now," she said. "I hate that this is happening. I hate what it has done to this house. I hate that some ministry creature looked at a postcard on my table as if my fear belonged to his office. But if you walk away tonight, you will not return to me whole. You know that, and so do I." Matthias felt something inside him loosen and fracture at once. "Sabine, no, let me finish. I am not blessing this. I am not admiring it. I am saying that after 32 years, I know the difference between your stubbornness and your conscience, and this is conscience. Unfortunately, it wears the same face." She inhaled slowly. "Do what you think you must, but do not lie to yourself and call it procedure anymore." When the line ended, he remained seated for several minutes with the phone in his hand. His life, once so carefully partitioned, had now begun to collapse into one decision. Around 22 and Druck, he began to prepare. He took the cash from the emergency envelope in the wardrobe that Sabine had once insisted they keep for outages and forgotten cards. He packed spare clothes, a flashlight, his reading glasses, 2 pens, an old camera with removable storage, the envelope of copied documents, and Clara's manifest fragment sealed in plastic. He left the ministry-issued laptop in a drawer. He switched off the ministry phone and placed it in the bread tin, absurdly, as if an old domestic container could shield him from digital reach. Then he took out a smaller private phone he used only for family and prepaid it online through an old account not linked to his payroll services. He wrote Sabine a note and tore up 3 earlier versions before finding words plain enough to survive their own inadequacy. "I am going to the Eiffel. I do not know when I will return. If anyone official comes, say you believed I was staying with a friend in Mainz. I am sorry for bringing this into our home. You were right about all of it." He left the note beneath the lamp in the living room. At 23:11, Petra's burner text arrived. "Journalist Eva Lindner. Use only if you have proof ordinary people can understand. If you send fragments, they will bury you before she can print." Then 30 seconds later, a second message. "Do not trust any uniform at the reserve. Some are private security in borrowed state language." Matthias deleted both texts after memorizing the number. Midnight found him still awake, sitting in the darkened apartment with his packed bag by the door and the Eiffel route open in his mind. Forest roads, reserve fences, dead telecom corridors, an old relay station under a tower ridge. He should have felt fear more cleanly. Instead, he felt the dull ache of impending damage, because continuing would not only endanger him, it would damage his marriage, his name inside the ministry, Petra's career, perhaps Lena's peace once the story surfaced publicly. The investigation was no longer a separate chamber he could visit and leave. It had breached the walls. At 0117, a message arrived from Clara, not from her old landline, of course, but from a temporary mobile number Matthias had never given her. Only 4 words. They asked about Henrik. Then another message 20 seconds later. "Please don't be late." Matthias looked at the dark room around him, at Sabine's coat still hanging by the door, at the packed bag on the floor, at the silent evidence he had gathered from dead funds, dead men, and almost dead witnesses. There was no easy way back now, only the road west, and whatever waited beneath the respectable language of wildlife preservation in the hills of the Eiffel. He left Frankfurt at 0340, while the city still belonged to delivery vans, insomniacs, and those who had chosen not to sleep rather than those who could not. The streets were nearly empty. Signals changed for no one. Rain from the previous evening had dried into a dull sheen on tram rails and crossing stones. Matthias drove west with the heater low and the window cracked open a finger's width to keep himself alert. Cold air entered in thin bursts, carrying the smell of asphalt, distant smoke, and the river whenever the road dipped near it. At that hour, the Autobahn felt less like infrastructure than a long administrative sentence written across the dark. Exit signs appeared and vanished. Freight trucks moved in patient columns. Service stations glowed in the distance like sterile islands. He had driven these routes before for audits, conferences, committee hearings, all the ordinary migrations of federal work. But this journey had no paperwork to justify it, no ministry envelope on the passenger seat, no return meeting waiting at the far end. Only a map, a dead zone, a reserve designed to look boring, and the fading chance that Henrik Adler might still exist somewhere beneath it. He passed Wiesbaden, then Limburg, then the long stretches where the land began to lift and harden. By dawn, the sky had opened into a pale, exhausted grey. Forest edges emerged. Wet fields lay under mist. Church spires appeared in villages still half asleep. The Eifel did not announce itself dramatically. It gathered, dark slopes, basalt walls, roads that narrowed without apology. A landscape that felt older than policy and therefore resistant to it. Matthias left the main route near dawn and followed secondary roads south and west, keeping off the more obvious access lanes toward the reserve. He had memorized the maintenance corridors Petra and he had traced from the permits. The public entrance to the Eifel Nord Fauna Recovery Reserve lay on the eastern side, marked in planning documents by a visitor's car park, an educational annex, and limited access barriers. But the reinforced service road branched away through older forestry land and climbed toward the Tower Ridge Rainer had implied and the anonymous note had confirmed. At 0618, he pulled into a disused lay-by, screened by fir and low beech, killed the engine, and sat without moving for a full minute. The silence outside was not total. Wind moved faintly through the trees. Somewhere farther down the slope, water ran over stone. A crow called once and was answered from a greater distance. Under those sounds lay a deeper stillness, the kind that belonged to rural areas before the day's machinery began. He stepped out, shouldered the bag, and locked the car. The air smelled of wet bark, cold earth, and something chemical so faint he might have imagined it. He stood listening again, orienting himself against the map and the ridgeline visible between trunks. The reserve, if the permits were honest even in their dishonesty, occupied the basin beyond. The old telecom relay, if it still existed, would lie under the Tower Ridge to the northwest, concealed somewhere along the older utility cut before the slope dropped toward the protected zone. He began to walk. The first kilometer was nothing more than a forestry track, cracked in places, patched in others, with moss growing thickly along the edges and wheel ruts hardened by old frost. Mist moved low between the trees, not enough to disorient, but enough to compress distance. At one bend, he found new tire marks overlaying older erosion, deep and broad, recent enough that the gravel still held sharp impressions. Heavy vehicle, not a ranger's van. He crouched and measured the width with his hand, then moved on. As the light strengthened, the forest changed character. It no longer felt merely rural. It felt administered. Small marker posts appeared at regular intervals without public signage. Drainage channels had been cut too neatly. A cable warning sign stood half hidden behind ivy, not in the green-white style of civilian forestry infrastructure, but in a muted grey used for technical service corridors. Twice he saw motion-sensitive camera housings mounted high on poles and painted to resemble bird boxes from a distance. Environmental virtue, Rainer had said. Matthias thought of solar panels, educational signage, restricted bird habitats, Germany hiding its worst rooms behind responsible language. At 0706, the first sign appeared. Eifel Nord Fauna Recovery Reserve, protected habitat. Authorized personnel only beyond this point. Below the text was a stylized silhouette of a lynx. The sign stood beside a chain barrier left deliberately open. Matthias did not use the road beyond it. Instead, he moved parallel through the trees until the slope steepened and the ground underfoot turned rocky. From there, he could see more. The reserve's public face lay below, a modest visitor building with a green roof, 2 outbuildings, solar panels angled toward the weak morning light, fencing tasteful enough to appear harmless, and 3 parked utility vehicles bearing environmental service logos. Beyond them, however, the land dipped into a wooded basin, cut by access roads far better maintained than any wildlife education center required. A second perimeter fence, harder to see, traced the contour farther back. And on the western side, partially masked by the slope, sat a long, low structure built into the hillside with only its reinforced entrance and ventilation stacks visible. Not a bunker one advertised. A service annex, perhaps, if one were lying on paper. A lid if one were not. Matthias took out the old camera and captured the basin, the secondary fence, the reinforced entrance, the pattern of roads. Documentation first, interpretation later. Then he turned northwest toward the tower ridge. The climb was slower. Loose stone shifted under his boots. The trees thinned near the crest, and the wind grew sharper there, carrying the metallic smell he had noticed earlier, but stronger now. Ozone, or something adjacent to it. At 0741, he saw the relay tower through the mist, a narrow steel structure on a concrete platform, older than the mobile mast beside it, ringed by security fencing that had long ago ceased to impress anyone who knew how to cut through old wire. The official tower bore telecom maintenance plates and a recent regional contractor logo, but half obscured behind the slope was something else. A concrete hatch structure built into the ground like a buried pillbox. No signage, no visible door handle, just a steel access plate inset flush with the wall and a rusting vent grill above it. Old relay station still live beneath Tower Ridge. The note on Petra's map had been precise. Matthias circled the structure once, keeping low. A padlocked utility gate stood to one side, but the chain had been replaced recently. Someone still came here. A buried conduit trench ran from the hatch downhill toward the basin. Telecommunications, yes, but perhaps also something else. Data, power, command routing. He found the keypad recessed under a steel flap. That stopped him. He had expected mechanical locks, not an active access system. The panel was old but not dead. A faint indicator glowed amber beneath scratched polycarbonate. Amber. He stared at it longer than he should have. Then he looked around again, took a breath, and tried the most obvious combinations first. Old telecom contractor defaults, common maintenance overrides, dates connected to the 1988 incident. Nothing. The panel remained mute. He was about to step back when he noticed something handwritten in grease pencil on the inside lip of the steel flap, almost erased by time and weather. A12R, not a full code. Perhaps never meant to be one, but enough of a prompt that his mind began working through possibilities. A12 was the receiving code from Clara's postcard insert. R could mean relay, or ridge, or revision. He entered A12, then paused. Letters were not accepted, only numbers, so he translated 12 and 18. No. Too simple. Then another thought. Old German telecom systems often mapped sector and relay in paired numeric sequences. A12R could mean A12-17, with R the 18th letter, but indexed from 0 in contractor shorthand. It was thin logic, but thin logic had brought him this far. He keyed 12-17. Nothing. He tried 12-18. The amber light flickered, then turned green. A mechanical clunk sounded somewhere behind the concrete. Matthias stood motionless for half a second, shocked not by success, but by how much relief success carried. A failed code would have allowed retreat, delay, another day of thought. Green meant movement. He pulled the steel plate. Behind it, a recessed lever released the hatch with a heavy inward sigh. Cold air flowed out, stale and metallic, carrying dust, machine oil, and beneath both a sharper note he knew at once from Clara's postcards. Ozone. He switched on the flashlight and descended. The stairwell was narrow concrete, painted decades ago in institutional grey, now flaking to reveal older layers beneath. The walls sweated moisture. At the bottom stood a small relay room crowded with dead cabinets, abandoned cable racks, and one newer equipment bay humming quietly in the corner. The old station had not been revived, it had been selectively repurposed. On the far wall, behind an open service panel, a fiber bridge terminated in a hardened junction box labeled not with civilian telecom markings, but with an alphanumeric code printed on military stock. AD3, North Node, Amber Depth. The initials struck him with such force that he had to grip the flashlight harder to keep from dropping it. Pieces connect, he thought. Not elegantly, not fully, but enough. Amber transfer, amber holding, amber depth, north node. This relay was not incidental infrastructure. It was one of the project's technical lungs. He photographed the junction box, the labels, the equipment serials. Then he opened the newer rack and found what he had hoped for and dreaded equally. A maintenance terminal, ruggedized, powered, still running on a hardened local interface, bridged to the facility network below. The screen demanded authentication. Matthias sat in the operator's chair, heart beating too hard now, and studied the login prompt. He was no hacker. He knew accounting systems, archival routes, procurement language. But Reiner had said the relay might bypass the military firewall. That implied maintenance access, and maintenance systems were usually built by engineers who valued uptime over elegance. He tried default contractor credentials from the regional telecom documents Petra had found. Denied. He tried the reserve's maintenance vendor ID paired with its invoice route code. Denied. He forced himself to slow down. Around him the room hummed softly. Above him, somewhere beyond the concrete, the forest went on being a forest. And below, beneath the basin and the reinforced entrance, perhaps under further rock still, something waited behind decades of money and administrative language. He scanned the rack labels again. AD3, North Node, Maintenance Cycle Group, Rhine Alpha, Fallback User Group, Holding, Holding. He entered Holding as the user field. For the password, he looked again at the relay code scratched under the flap, A12R. This time he used 12,000A holding. The terminal paused, then opened. Matthias exhaled once, soundlessly. Directories populated the screen in sparse monochrome lists, transport logs, medical continuity, site environmental suppression, communications isolation, external narrative management. He stared at the last line. External narrative management. There it was, the bureaucratic equivalent of a body under a sheet. The proof that the lie itself had an operating folder. He copied the visible directory tree onto the camera and then into a notebook. His hands steadier now because the work had finally become legible again. Transport logs confirmed special movements within the last 2 weeks. One tagged A12 segment reallocation, another marked depth containment transfer 2. Medical continuity listed 12 baseline entries historically, then 10 active, 2 moved below continuity threshold. 2 moved. Reiner had been right. Then Matthias opened transport logs and felt the shape of the hidden truth sharpen. The moved cases were not identified by names on the current sheet, only by historical unit numbers and old casualty tags. But one line preserved a family cross-reference flag that the system had failed to clean. Adler H. Scheduled transfer pending. Before they move, Henrik. The anonymous note had not been warning him abstractly. It had been timing him. Matthias went next into external narrative management. Inside were templates, press language, committee talking points, legal justifications, historical contingency drafts. He read phrases that made his stomach harden. Long-term quarantine program under emergency medical secrecy. Heroic containment by affected service members, families protected from traumatic contact risk, no evidence of ongoing public hazard. It was all there, the shape of the future scandal already manufactured, the acceptable outer truth prepared to swallow the darker one whole. He had begun to see the full outline now. The crash had been staged, the men had been buried administratively while kept alive medically. The wildlife reserve masked the bunker masked the deeper site. And if exposure ever forced disclosure, the government would release only the noble, manageable version. Sacrifice, containment, regrettable secrecy, lessons learned. Not confusion, not incomprehension, not whatever remained active beneath amber depth. He had the shape, but not yet the proof that ordinary people could understand. Not yet the files that could survive denial. As he moved deeper into the directories, searching for export functions, the terminal chimed softly. A new window opened automatically across the screen. Live transport status. Update. A12 Adler H. Movement initiated. ETA to lift corridor 001842. Matthias stared at the countdown. The most important proof was still missing. and in less than 19 minutes, Henrik Adler was going to disappear deeper into the system. For a moment, Matthias did not move. The countdown on the screen kept running, each second sliding away with a digital indifference that felt more obscene than panic would have. The relay room hummed around him. The flashlight lay across the desk, its beam angled toward dead cabinets and old cable trays. Somewhere inside the concrete walls, machinery carried current along lines that had outlived governments, alliances, justifications. A12 Adler, H movement initiated, ETA to lift corridor, 001842, then 001841, then 001840. He forced himself to breathe once, deeply, and returned to the screen. Fear would not help now, neither would outrage. He needed a path. The transport update window showed a schematic link option beside the countdown. He clicked it. A crude architectural diagram loaded, stripped of aesthetic detail, all function and depth. The public reserve structures appeared at the top as little more than service outlines. Beneath them lay the bunker level, intake, medical holding, filtration, stores, security, lift corridor. And lower still, rendered in darker grey, another layer connected by a heavier shaft marked simply depth access. Amber depth. Henrik Adler's movement route flashed from medical continuity Ward C toward lift corridor 2, then downward. The relay station where Matthias sat linked into the same network through a maintenance spine that ran along the northern ridge and terminated at an access sublevel above the bunker's telecom control room. Not a direct path into the deepest levels, but a way in. He copied the schematic to the camera, then searched for door overrides. Maintenance access menus opened under the holding credentials, but the deeper permissions were grayed out. Still, the system gave him enough. Service hatch references, security blind intervals, ventilation route diagrams, and one notation that made his pulse steady rather than rise. Lift corridor 2 under partial camera outage. Manual verification required. Someone, somewhere, had created a small imperfection in the machinery. Maybe the same unknown hand that had written on Petra's map. Maybe someone inside the facility desperate enough to help without speaking. Matthias wrote down the route and zipped the notebook into his coat. He copied as many files as he could onto the camera's storage card using the terminal's maintenance export function, though the transfer speed was slow and the available formats inconsistent. Enough for later, perhaps. Not enough for proof yet. He needed something no ministry could reframe into policy language. He needed Henrik alive. At the hatch, he hesitated only long enough to listen. Nothing above but wind at the tower ridge and the faint metallic tap of loose fittings. He stepped back out into the cold morning and moved downhill along the buried conduit trench, keeping within the tree line until the slope opened above the reserve basin. From here, the public face of the site looked even more offensively reasonable in daylight. Educational signage, bird silhouettes on placards, a green-roofed visitor center, the architecture of reassurance. Beyond that, however, the reinforced western structure cut into the hillside looked harder now that he knew its shape from the schematic. Ventilation stacks, service bays, security cameras nested discreetly beneath eaves painted in earth tones. A private security vehicle stood half hidden behind the annex, its markings disguised as Environmental Compliance Service. Borrowed state language, Petra had written, "Do not trust any uniform at the reserve." He moved along the ridge until he found the maintenance cut shown on the relay diagram, a narrow concrete drainage channel dropping toward the bunker's upper telecom intake. It was partially concealed under steel grating and brush netting. A man not looking for it would have stepped over it. Matthias slid down carefully, boots scraping wet concrete, palms cold against lichen-dark walls. At the bottom, a locked service grille barred the way. The lock housing bore the same alphanumeric family as the relay junction box, AD3, AUX. He tried the maintenance override sequence from the relay menus. The first attempt failed. The second released the bolt with a dull mechanical snap. Inside, the air changed at once. It was warmer, drier, and filtered, yet beneath the manufactured cleanliness lay something mineral, metallic, and faintly sulfurous. Exactly the undertone from Clara's postcards, but stronger now. Ozone, too, a smell like electrical storms trapped underground. The service corridor beyond was low and functional, crowded with insulated pipes, cable conduits, and maintenance panels stenciled with numbers rather than names. Lighting strips buzzed overhead. The concrete here was newer than the relay stations, poured during a later retrofit, but sections of the walls had been built against something older. Rough basalt surfaces, cut back and encased only where needed. The bunker had not replaced the mountain. It had negotiated with it. Matthias moved quickly but not recklessly, following the route from the sketch in his memory. At one intersection, he heard voices and flattened himself inside an equipment recess while two men in dark utility uniforms passed, speaking in clipped, bored German about a transport seal and a clearance delay. Neither wore visible military insignia. Both carried sidearms low on their hips beneath soft-shell jackets marked with the reserve's environmental logo. Private security indeed. When they had gone, he continued downward. The corridor opened abruptly into a telecom control room, staffed by no one at that moment. Only humming racks, status screens, and a coffee mug left near an unattended console. On the wall hung a laminated evacuation chart that referred not to animals or habitat personnel, but to sectors, holding, medical, depth operations, isolation lifts. Any remaining doubt about the true nature of the reserve died there. He photographed everything. Then a door alarm flashed amber on one of the consoles. Lift Corridor 2, manual verification pending, Henrik's route. Matthias followed the sign arrows through another passage and emerged above a glass observation strip overlooking a long corridor lined in brushed steel and pale epoxy flooring. Medical trolleys stood parked against one wall. Two orderlies in sealed transport gowns waited beside a wheeled isolation pod the size of a coffin, but mounted higher and fitted with clear composite panels. The pod's internal surfaces gleamed under recessed lights. Its air unit emitted a soft, continuous hiss. At the far end, double doors opened. A small convoy appeared, two more transport staff, one armed security officer, a physician in green scrubs beneath a sterile coverall, and between them, on a rolling hospital bed with containment rails raised, lay a man so thin and altered by years of managed survival that Matthias might have missed the humanity in him had the posture not been unmistakably human first. Henrik Adler. Matthias knew it without knowing how. Perhaps because, after so much paperwork and absence, the sight of an actual body made every lie preceding it suddenly seem flimsy. Henrik's hair was almost entirely white. His face had narrowed to sharp planes under translucent skin. Tubing ran from his arm to a portable infusion unit. Transparent patches marked sensor sites along his neck and temple. But his eyes were open. That was the terrible and decisive thing. He was not a sedated medical object. He was conscious enough to turn his head slightly as the bed moved. And even from behind the glass strip, Matthias saw confusion there, then resistance, then a brief terrible awareness as if some buried faculty recognized movement itself as danger. The physician said something Matthias could not hear through the glass. Henrik's lips moved. One of the orderlies leaned closer. Henrik moved again, more urgently this time, and lifted one frail hand against the rail. Matthias found himself leaning forward unconsciously, reading the shape of the mouth because he could not hear the words. Again. Again. Then he understood. Clara. Henrik was saying her name, not perfectly, not with strength, but unmistakably. For an instant, all the structures around Matthias, budget codes, cover programs, relay schematics, legal phrasing, fell away. There remained only a man who had been administratively buried for 38 years, and who, on the edge of another removal into deeper secrecy, was still asking for his wife. The armed guard keyed the lift access panel. The steel doors at the far end parted. Beyond them lay only a square of descending industrial light and a sign mounted over the shaft in plain internal lettering. Depth access 2. Authorized transfer only. No mystery in the wording. No poetry. Only procedure applied to horror until horror became habit. Matthias moved before the decision fully formed. The observation strip door opened onto a side stair that dropped directly to the corridor. Alarms would follow if he used it. He knew that, yet the path existed and the countdown in his head had reached 0 anyway. He went down fast, hand sliding along the rail, shoes striking metal steps harder than caution advised. At the bottom, he pushed through the service door and stepped into the corridor, just as the convoy began angling the bed toward the isolation pod. For 3 full seconds, no one understood what they were seeing. A middle-aged man in a city coat and damp boots appearing out of a restricted stairwell did not fit the corridor's reality. Bureaucratic systems often hesitated before absurdity. Matthias used that hesitation. "Stop," he shouted, louder than he would have believed himself capable of. "Federal Audit Authority. This transfer is being recorded under unlawful civilian expenditure concealment." The words were improvised nonsense in legal terms, but they sounded official enough to slow hands already trained to obey process. The physician froze. One orderly stepped back. The guard reached for his sidearm, then checked the movement halfway, uncertain whether he was confronting a trespasser, an inspector, or a political problem disguised as a man. Matthias took out the old camera and lifted it high so the lens was visible. "I have the manifests," he said. "I have the continuity logs. If this patient disappears below, without named authorization attached, every one of you becomes individually visible." That landed, because institutions could absorb many sins, but not always the loss of anonymity that made those sins operationally bearable. The physician recovered first. "Who are you?" "Someone already too visible," Matthias said. Henrik's head turned toward the sound of his voice. Their eyes met. Matthias had expected vacancy, morphine blur, institutional dullness. Instead, he saw a terrible clarity flare for one instant inside the ruin of the man's face. Henrik looked from Matthias to the camera to the lift doors and understood enough. His lips moved again. Matthias stepped closer. This time he heard it. "Nicht runter," not down. The physician gestured sharply at the transport staff. "Continue movement." But the guard still hesitated, and in that hesitation, something else entered the corridor. A low vibration, not from machinery overhead, from below. It passed upward through the floor into Matthias's legs before it became sound. A deep subsonic tremor that seemed less heard than inhabited. Henrik reacted instantly. His entire body tightened against the rails. The physician swore under his breath. One of the orderlies crossed herself without seeming aware of it. So Clara had remembered correctly. Felt first, sound later. The deeper sight was not a metaphor. Something below them still generated this response in people who knew it. Red lights blinked once along the lift frame, then steadied amber. A console somewhere down the hall began sounding a clipped alert. Transport hold. Depth pressure fluctuation. Transport hold. Depth pressure fluctuation. The convoy stalled in confusion. Matthias stepped to Henrik's bedside. Up close, the old soldier smelled of antiseptic, medication, and the same charged mineral air that saturated the facility. His eyes watered from effort. "Henrik," Matthias said, keeping his voice low and steady, "your wife Clara is alive. She kept every postcard. She knows you were taken. Do you understand me?" Henrik stared at him. Then the thinnest movement imaginable passed through his face, something between grief and astonishment. His hand, skeletal and cold, closed weakly over Matthias's wrist. "Tunnel," he whispered. Matthias bent closer. "What tunnel?" Henrik swallowed with visible pain. "Not quarantine." His breath caught. "Below, opened. They lied after. We were barrier. Barrier." There it was. The word Petra had nearly given shape to the day before. The 12 men were not merely patients. They were a boundary condition in human form, maintained between the upper bunker and whatever had been disturbed below. Before Matthias could ask more, a new sound struck the corridor, the heavy slam of distant security doors cycling shut. The guard finally drew his weapon, not raised yet, but out. From speakers overhead, a calm female voice announced, "Unauthorized presence in transfer sector C. Security response in motion." The physician backed away from the bed, as if the entire scene had become administratively toxic. One of the orderlies whispered, "Ach du Gott." Matthias looked from Henrik to the armed guard to the amber-lit lift doors and understood with hard clarity that the decisive path toward the truth had opened. But only briefly. He had found Henrik alive. He had heard him speak. He had learned the 12 men were a barrier, not simply a hidden medical cohort. And now security was coming. At the far end of the corridor, the stairwell door burst open. Two black-clad response officers entered at speed. Behind them, walking rather than running, as if panic belonged to lesser people, came the thin defense representative from Frankfurt, the man with the discreet tie pin. He looked directly at Matthias and said, almost gently, "Herr Voss, you have entered the wrong layer of the story." The corridor seemed to contract around the sentence. "Herr Voss, you have entered the wrong layer of the story." The defense representative's voice was almost courteous, which made it more chilling than anger would have. He stood just inside the stairwell threshold with his dark overcoat buttoned high, the discreet tie pin still in place, as if he had arrived for a hearing rather than an incursion into a buried medical transport sector. Behind him, the two response officers fanned out with disciplined speed, black uniforms stripped of insignia, compact weapons held at chest level in the posture of men trained to control rather than debate. The armed guard already in the corridor lowered his sidearm slightly, uncertain now whether his authority had just been superseded or clarified. Henrik Adler's hand remained around Matthias's wrist. Not strong, not enough to restrain him, enough to make the moment human. The red and amber status lights above the lift frame kept pulsing in steady alternation. Transport hold, depth pressure fluctuation. Transport hold, depth pressure fluctuation. The calm female voice from the overhead system repeated the notice every few seconds, but now the words had changed. Unauthorized presence in transfer sector C. Stand by for continuity containment. Continuity containment. Even the language was infected. They did not call it detention, lockdown, or emergency response. They called it continuity. As if the preservation of a lie and the preservation of life had fused completely inside the institution's mind. Matthias did not release Henrik's hand. The defense representative took another step into the corridor, shoes soundless on the epoxy floor. "Let go of the patient," he said. "He has a name," Matthias replied. Something unreadable passed through the man's face. Not pity, not irritation. Recognition, perhaps, that Matthias had crossed beyond the level at which euphemism could still perform its anesthetic function. "Yes," he said, "and he has a medical status you do not understand." Henrik's fingers tightened weakly. His mouth moved, but no sound came the first time. Matthias bent closer. "Clara," Henrik whispered again, and then, with effort that visibly hurt him, "Don't let them below." The physician took one involuntary step backward. The words had clearly not been meant for open hearing. One of the orderlies stared at Henrik as though she had suddenly remembered that patients were not supposed to narrate their own transfer. The defense representative's eyes moved to the physician. "Sedate him, Jem," he said, and there it was. Not a debate over procedure, not verification, sedation as administrative correction. Matthias straightened. "No." One of the black-clad officers shifted his weapon upward half an inch. The representative kept his gaze on Matthias. "You are tired, frightened, and dramatically outside your clearance. Whatever you believe you have found here will not improve by turning this corridor into theater." The word theater nearly made Matthias laugh. Around them stood the actual stage set. Environmental cover, dead soldiers maintained underground, a stalled lift to something called depth access, a system warning about pressure fluctuation below, and a living man asking not to be taken farther down. This was not theater. It was the moment the decorations fell away. "He said they were a barrier," Matthias said, loud enough now for the physician and orderlies to hear clearly. "Not quarantine, barrier. Is that in your continuity templates too?" The defense representative did not answer, but the smallest pause occurred. The kind of pause institutions feared more than gunfire, because pauses allowed other people to think. One of the orderlies, young, pale, still holding the isolation pod rail, looked instinctively toward the physician. "Doctor?" she said. The physician snapped, too quickly. "Continue protocol." Yet he did not move to administer the sedative himself. That hesitation mattered. It gave Matthias a dangerous idea. He raised the old camera higher, angling the lens toward the corridor. Henrik's face, the lift signage, the armed officers, the environmental logos on the staff uniforms. Ordinary proof. Proof any journalist could show. Proof the public could understand before the deeper parts of the story became too strange to survive contact with the world above. My files have already gone out, he lied. The representative's expression did not change, but one of the black-clad officers looked at him for instruction. Good, Matthias thought. Let uncertainty spread. Then you have behaved more recklessly than I assumed, the representative said. No, Matthias answered. I have behaved more publicly. The corridor seemed to hold its breath. For one instant, Matthias believed that might be enough. Not to win, not to escape, but to slow them further, to widen the gap in the machinery just enough for one irreversible act. Then the floor tremor came again. Harder this time. Not a mild subsonic pulse now, but a deep mechanical organic shudder rising through the soles of the feet, through the bed frame, through the lift doors and the steel rails of the isolation pod. The lights flickered. Somewhere below, metal groaned with the awful prolonged strain of something under pressure. Henrik convulsed violently. The monitoring unit on his transport bed emitted a sharp cascade of alarms. His oxygen saturation line dropped. One of the adhesive sensor patches peeled partly loose against his neck. The infusion pump clicked into warning mode. The physician moved immediately then, instincts finally stronger than secrecy. He's destabilizing it, he said. Sedate and transfer, the representative replied. No, if the depth fluctuation is propagating upward, moving him now could trigger systemic collapse. Do it. The physician hesitated again, and in that hesitation, Matthias saw the true order of fear inside the facility. The doctor feared the patient's body. The representative feared the story. Henrik's hand slipped from Matthias's wrist and clawed weakly at the rail. His eyes, suddenly wide with effort, fixed on Matthias with an intensity that no sedation haze could hide. Folder, he rasped. Locker, North Infirmary, Blue Key, Falk. Then he coughed, a dry, tearing sound that seemed to scrape its way out of a chest too long, governed by filters and drugs. Locker, North Infirmary, Blue Key, Falk. A hidden cache, more proof, the decisive piece perhaps. Before Matthias could ask another word, the physician was there with a syringe uncapped. Matthias grabbed the man's wrist by reflex. Everything broke at once. One of the response officers lunged forward. The armed guard shouted. The orderly nearest the pod stumbled back, striking the steel frame. The camera slipped from Matthias's hand and hit the floor, skidding under the bed, but thank God not visibly shattered. The officer slammed Matthias against the wall hard enough that white light burst behind his eyes. Pain shot through his shoulder. He tasted iron where his teeth caught the inside of his cheek. Enough, the representative said, still calm, but calm was no longer in control of the corridor. Henrik's monitor screamed in sustained alarm. The tremor from below intensified into a rolling vibration that made the lift frame shudder visibly. A warning beacon above the far door switched from amber to red. Depth pressure variance critical. Containment seal review required. Even the black-clad officer pinning Matthias turned his head at that. The physician swore and looked toward the lift with naked alarm. We cannot send anyone down on that variance. Then stabilize the patient and hold here, the representative said. Here, in the corridor? The doctor stared at him. If the variance breaches the upper baffles, hold here. There it was again. Policy over comprehension. Hierarchy over whatever reality the lower levels were currently enforcing. The officer twisted Matthias's arm higher behind his back. Fire ran up his shoulder. Another officer snapped restraints around one wrist. At that moment, Henrik spoke again. Not loudly, not clearly to everyone, but enough. He lied. Henrik breathed, looking not at Matthias now, but at the representative. Crash. After. Not accident. Burned. Empty. The physician froze. So did one of the orderlies. The representative's face finally changed. Not much, just enough for the mask to crack. Beneath it was not outrage, but exhaustion, the expression of a man who had spent too many years managing impossible things and could no longer decide whether truth was a threat or a mercy. You should not still be lucid, he said softly. Henrik gave something like a smile then, though it looked more like pain. Neither should you. The line struck everyone in the corridor differently. For Matthias, it landed like evidence disguised as insult. This man knew the representative, not just as an official shape in a coat, but as someone with years inside the machinery. Another witness. Another layer of continuity between the false funerals, the long medical holding, and whatever the bunker had become. The tremor below deepened once more. Then, from somewhere beyond the lift shaft, there came a sound that silenced the corridor more completely than any shouted command. A low, resonant roar? No, not quite. A sustained pressure wave, half mechanical, half impossible to classify, traveling upward through ducts and rock and steel until it entered the air itself. It was too deep for any ordinary siren, too textured for a simple equipment failure. The kind of sound that made language hesitate. One orderly whimpered. The physician went visibly grey. Matthias understood then, with a cold totality that left no room for abstraction, that the lies above had not merely been built to protect careers or conceal a medical scandal. They had been built because no one had ever found words that could survive exposure to whatever lived below the acceptable narrative. The representative heard it too, and for the first time, he looked older. A wall phone near the lift rang sharply. He crossed to it, took the call, listened for 5 seconds, and said only, "Seal upper transfer, I'm aware." When he turned back, the corridor had already changed in his mind from a scene to be controlled into a problem to be triaged. "Take Herr Voss," he said. "Administrative isolation, not external handoff." That phrase saved Matthias's life. External handoff might have meant disappearance. Administrative isolation meant paperwork, custody, process, time. Time was enough. As the second restraint snapped around his other wrist, Matthias forced himself to think through the pain. Camera under the bed, locker in North Infirmary, blue key, Falk, Henrik alive, representative compromised by witness recognition, depth unstable. Then his eyes found the camera again beneath the bed frame. One of the orderlies found it too. She was the younger one, the pale woman who had earlier asked the physician for confirmation. Her gaze met Matthias's for less than a second. Something passed there. Not allegiance, not courage, just the terrible understanding of an ordinary person who suddenly knows she has been living inside a structure more monstrous than her job description allowed. Without drawing attention, she nudged the camera farther beneath the bed with the side of her shoe. A tiny act, but deliberate, an ally perhaps, or simply someone no longer able to obey cleanly. The officers pulled Matthias away from Henrik's bedside. Henrik's head turned weakly after him. "Blue," he whispered again, "North Infirmary." Then the physician finally administered the sedative, hands shaking almost imperceptibly. Henrik's eyelids fluttered, but he was not fully gone when Matthias was dragged toward the stairwell. Their eyes met once more. 38 years of administrative death lay between that look and the world above. Matthias felt its weight like a verdict. At the threshold, the representative stopped him with a raised hand. The officers held position. "Herr Voss," he said, voice quiet enough that only Matthias could hear clearly, "you believe this ends in exposure and moral clarity. It doesn't. It ends in translation. The public will only ever be given the version they can survive." Matthias, breathing hard from pain and adrenaline, looked back at the red-lit lift doors, the isolation pod, the sedated man who should have been dead since 1988. "Then I'll make survival more difficult for you," he said. For the first time, something like respect flickered in the other man's expression. Or pity. It was hard to tell. They hauled Matthias into the stairwell and up through service passages that blurred under fluorescent light and shoulder pain. At each landing, he listened for routes, memorized door labels, counted turns. Administrative isolation, the representative had said. Good. Process meant space. Space meant error. But as he was pushed through a reinforced door into a small, secure holding room on an upper service level, another realization hit him with even greater force than the restraints cutting into his wrists. Henrik had given him the next path. North Infirmary, Blue Key, Falk. The final evidence had not yet been found. But now it had a location, and the cost of reaching it had already begun. His shoulder throbbed. His career was effectively over. Sabine had been forced from her home. Petra was likely under scrutiny or worse. Henrik had been sedated back into managed silence after using what little strength he had left to keep one more hidden route alive. This was the first climax. Matthias understood even in his pain. He had reached the truth's outer chamber. He had seen the living proof, and he had been captured before he could carry the decisive piece back to the surface. Then, as the officers shut the door and the lock bolts engaged, a final sound came through the ventilation grill overhead. Not the deep pressure wave from below this time, something smaller, a metallic click, followed by a woman's voice whispered so close to the vent that it seemed to enter the room like a secret already in progress. "If you can still walk," she said, "the blue key is already on its way to you." For several seconds after the whisper, Matthias thought he had imagined it. Pain could do that. Exhaustion too. They could take a sentence and place it inside the skull with such precision that it arrived seeming external. He stood in the middle of the holding room, wrists still bound in front of him now rather than behind. An administrative courtesy, perhaps, or a sign that whoever locked him in believed age and shock had done most of the work already. The room itself was function stripped to insult. Concrete walls painted a tired institutional grey. A steel table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs, one fixed, one not. A narrow sink, no window, a ceiling vent wide enough for air and little else. Above him, fluorescent light buzzed with the indifferent persistence of all official confinement. He stepped closer to the vent. "Who is there?" he asked. No answer came, only the steady movement of filtered air, and beneath it, the distant buried machinery of the site continuing its work. Then something slid through the vent grill and struck the floor near the table leg with a small metallic tap. Matthias froze. A key. Not blue exactly, but attached to a chipped blue plastic tag marked with a faded handwritten NI4. North Infirmary. The realization passed through him with such force that he had to grip the edge of the steel table to steady himself. Henrik had told the truth. The whisper had been real. Someone inside the facility, someone with access, timing, and more courage than safety, was now actively moving him toward the final evidence, or toward a trap. He bent, picked up the key, and turned it in his hand. It was old, not ceremonial, not electronic, not part of the sleek, modernized layers above. A physical key from a facility old enough to trust locks before it trusted coded permissions. The tag bore scrape marks and a faint residue at one edge, as if it had once been taped under a desk or behind a panel. Falk had left roots before, hidden slips in postcards, notes delivered after visits. It was entirely possible that the deeper truth inside Amber had survived not in official continuity at all, but in a shadow continuity of human sabotage stretching back decades. Small acts of disobedience handed from one frightened conscience to another. He moved to the door. Locked, naturally, but the holding room's lock housing was mechanical beneath its electronic panel. A legacy setup disguised by newer casing. Administrative isolation. Not high-security detention, time bought by habit. If someone had sent the key, they likely knew that too. He crouched, inserted it into the lower cylinder, and turned. Nothing. Wrong door. Of course, the key was not for escape itself. It was for the locker in North Infirmary, exactly as Henrik had said. Matthias exhaled slowly and forced himself back into sequence. He examined the room more carefully. Ceiling vent, too narrow, sink plumbing enclosed. Table bolts immovable. But the second chair, the unfixed one, had one metal foot slightly bent. He tested it, then looked up at the fluorescent housing. The cover panel was held by quarter-turn catches. He dragged the chair beneath it, stood with his shoulder screaming at the movement, and reached up. One catch loosened, then the second. The cover came free in his hand. Inside, above the light tray, a maintenance void ran shallowly toward the corridor wall. Not enough for a man, but enough to expose conduits and, crucially, the old emergency release bar embedded in the door control housing. A relic from before modern secure protocols, designed so maintenance staff could override a jammed lock from inside during fire events. Someone had not forgotten that. Someone had counted on it. Using the bent chairfoot as a lever, he worked the release bar through the narrow gap until it shifted with a dull internal clack. The door clicked open. Matthias stood still for one full heartbeat, almost offended by how ordinary the sound was. A secret state facility, decades of buried men, depth levels below acceptable narrative. And the immediate obstacle gave way like a cheap office latch. That, too, felt German in the bleakest possible way. He opened the door a few centimeters and listened. No footsteps, no voices. Only the distant pulse of alarms elsewhere in the complex, and beneath them, the same intermittent subsonic vibration rising from below. Depth instability still unresolved. He slipped into the corridor. The upper service level was quieter now than during the capture. Whatever response teams had flooded the transfer sector were still occupied below, containing the fluctuation or trying to redefine it into paperwork. Red emergency strips glowed at floor level. Overhead lights had dimmed into power conservation mode. On a wall screen near the stairwell, status messages cycled through in clipped institutional language. Sector C sealed. Medical continuity review in progress. Depth operations suspended pending variance normalization. Suspended. Good. If depth operations were frozen, then Henrik's transfer had been delayed. He was still above, still reachable perhaps, but the locker came first. Final proof first. Then whatever version of rescue remained possible. Matthias moved through service passages using the evacuation chart he had memorized in telecom control. North Infirmary lay above the main continuity ward, accessible through an older medical wing predating the current holding layout. The farther he went, the more the bunker revealed its age. Modern epoxy floors gave way to older tile beneath later coatings. Doors changed from silent composite panels to heavier steel frames with rounded corners. Somewhere in the walls, old air systems still breathed behind newer ducts. At one junction, he heard rapid footfalls and stepped into a linen alcove just as two clinical staff hurried past, speaking in urgent fragments. Pressure wave reached B level this time. They're saying seal drift in the lower baffles. If they reopen lift 2 before recalibration, their voices vanished around the bend. Matthias waited, then continued. North Infirmary announced itself not by a sign on the main wall, but by a faded floor arrow, half concealed under later paint. Nord Int. The corridor there was narrower, colder, and less renovated. Old infirmary glass panels had been painted over from the inside. The smell changed too. Less of modern antiseptic, more of dust, bleach, medicinal residue embedded over years. It felt like a place once central to operations and later downgraded into storage or overflow once the facility's logic migrated downward. At the end of the hall stood a row of metal staff lockers. Blue tag NI4. Locker 4 sat slightly ajar at the top, but locked at the handle. Matthias inserted the key. The door opened with a small resistant scrape. Inside, at first glance, was almost nothing. A folded wool blanket, an old reserve maintenance jacket, a dented thermos. On the locker floor, a cardboard archive box with no label. His hands shook as he lifted it out and set it on a nearby examination trolley. Inside the box lay the shape of 30 years of unfinished conscience. There were files, yes, but not the sterile bureaucracy he expected. Not only that, there were human things. An audio cassette in a cracked case, a ring of duplicate keys, 2 old disposable cameras sealed in plastic, a typed memorandum with handwritten corrections in 2 different inks, a stack of photocopied incident logs, and beneath them all, wrapped in a hospital pillowcase yellowed by age, a thick bundle of documents tied with surgical tape. On top of the bundle, in angular handwriting Matthias now recognized from the 1992 letter, was one line. If this is being read, I failed to get them out alive. RF Rainer Falk. Matthias closed his eyes briefly, not because he needed the drama of the moment, but because grief had entered the room unexpectedly. Not for the dead man exactly, but for the shape of his failure, preserved so carefully by strangers. He cut the tape with a pair of scissors from the trolley tray and opened the bundle. The first pages were enough to change everything. Original casualty discrepancy report. September 1988. It showed 12 names marked dead in public transmission, but in the internal transport annex beside each one was a second notation. Alive post-event. Transferred under medical isolation order. Attached were signatures from Defense Medical Command and an emergency civilian liaison office. The crash had indeed been rewritten after the fact. The next file was worse. Photographs, not of bodies, of the staged crash site before press access. Burned wreckage in a field. Response personnel. And, at the edge of one frame, 3 sealed body pouches being unloaded from a refrigerated military van, bearing a different incident date on the side manifest clip. Bodies imported for the narrative. Matthias felt bile rise in his throat. He forced himself onward. There were continuity reviews of the 12 men during the first years underground, clinical language giving way slowly to something more frightened. Subject responses synchronized with lower site activity. Episodes of acute distress during depth resonance. Temporary stabilization when housed above layer 2 threshold. Family contact rejected due to barrier compromise risk. Barrier compromise risk. Henrik had not hallucinated the term. The documents used it clinically. The men were being kept alive in relation to the lower site, not simply despite it. Then he found the memorandum that made the rest coherent enough to expose. Date, 17th October 1988. Distribution severely restricted. Working conclusion. Personnel exposed during Eiffel Cave extraction may have become biologically entangled with subterranean agent environment. Observable effect includes persistent immunological distortion and reactive stabilization when held within calibrated proximity to source field. Removal attempts produce systemic collapse and lower site variance escalation. Recommendation: maintain exposed personnel in controlled upper containment as living attenuation layer until alternative barrier system can be engineered. Living attenuation layer. There it was, in words no public relations template could survive. Not heroic quarantine, not unfortunate medical secrecy. Human beings used as a barrier because the state could not understand or control what it had disturbed below. Matthias sat down hard on the stool beside the trolley, not from weakness, but because the sentence had altered the moral architecture of the entire case. The 12 men had not simply been abandoned after an accident. They had been repurposed, maintained as functional insulation between the inhabited world above and the active anomaly below. A betrayal so complete it ceased to resemble negligence and entered a colder category altogether. He photographed every page as quickly as he could. Then he found the audio cassette labeled Adler Private Request Unsent. No player in the locker, but one sat on a nearby infirmary desk beneath dust and a stack of expired procedural binders. Matthias inserted the tape and pressed play. Static hissed for a second. Then a voice emerged. Henrik's, but younger, weaker than health, stronger than the man on the transport bed. Clara, if this ever reaches you, then someone here finally decided to behave like a human being. A breath. They say we are contagious, but that is not the real reason. The real reason is that whatever is below reacts to us now, or through us. I don't understand it. None of us do. When they moved Dieter too far from the lower shaft, he began dying, and the instruments downstairs screamed like metal underwater. They moved him back and he stabilized. They say it means our bodies attenuate something. I say it means they turned us into equipment. Matthias's throat tightened. The tape continued. If they tell the country we died as heroes, do not believe the heroic part. We were buried because we were useful. If they tell you I never asked for you, that is a lie too. I ask every week. Sometimes every hour when I can still remember the shape of ordinary rooms. The recording ended abruptly in a burst of static. Proof ordinary people could understand. A living man's voice, an unsent testimony, not theory, not atmospheric mystery, not deep sight speculation beyond public comprehension. This was it. This was the final evidence. Then the corridor alarm changed pitch. No longer a containment tone, a search tone. A clipped 3-note sequence repeated twice, followed by the facility voice, now speaking with more urgency. Unauthorized access, Medical North. Security teams redirect. Matthias looked up sharply. They knew. Of course they knew. Administrative isolation bought time, not invisibility. Someone had discovered the open holding room or tracked a maintenance override. The window was closing. He shoved the memorandum bundle, the cassette, and the most critical incident logs into his bag. The rest he photographed frantically, including Falk's handwritten note and the continuity sheets naming the men as attenuation subjects. He grabbed the duplicate keys without knowing yet why. Footsteps sounded at the far end of the corridor, fast, more than one set. He switched off the cassette player, swept the remaining documents back into the box, and looked for an exit. The infirmary had 2 doors, the one he entered through, and another marked waste transfer. Service lift. He tried it. Unlocked. He slipped into a narrow service passage, smelling of bleach and old metal. The passage descended slightly, then forked. Above the left route, a sign read surface disposal. Above the right, lower decontamination and relay access. Relay access, the old Tower Ridge node. A path back toward the outside, or at least toward the only digital bridge he knew how to use. He took the right fork just as voices burst into the infirmary behind him. Lockers open. Check service routes. The search had begun. Matthias ran, pain tore through his shoulder with each stride. His breath rasped in the filtered air. Red floor lights strobed faintly ahead as the bunker shifted into full internal response. Yet under the adrenaline and the pain, another awareness moved with him. He had the truth now, not all of it perhaps, not the full nature of what lay below, not the complete mechanism of amber depth, but enough to destroy the acceptable lie, enough to expose the state's human barrier, enough to make translation harder, uglier, less survivable for those who had spent decades curating the public version. At the next junction, he nearly collided with a person coming the other way. The young orderly, the pale woman from the transfer corridor. She had no mask on now, only scrubs under an unzipped utility jacket. In her hand was Matthias's old camera. For a second they stared at each other. Then she thrust the camera into his chest. "You dropped this," she said, voice shaking. "And the upper team is sealing the western exits. You have maybe 6 minutes before the relay route locks." Matthias took the camera. "Why are you helping me?" Her face tightened with something close to disgust. At him, at herself, at the place around them, it was impossible to say. "Because I was told this was a quarantine hospital," she said, "not a place where dead men spend 40 years being used as architecture." Voices echoed behind them. She stepped back. "Go. And if you reach the terminal, don't just copy the files. Send them where they can't be retrieved." Then, after the briefest hesitation, she added, "Henrik asked for Clara even while they were injecting him. He thought they'd take him below and he'd lose the memory again. So don't fail him now." She turned and ran toward the voices, away from Matthias, deliberately drawing pursuit into the wrong branch. A betrayal had begun the story. Now, at the edge of the truth, a stranger was paying to interrupt it. Matthias ran harder. The passage steepened toward relay access, and overhead, somewhere heavy doors began to cycle shut. He had the evidence, he had the voice, he had Falk's proof and Henrik's testimony, but exposure was not yet accomplished. It was only possible, and in facilities like this, possibility died quickly, if not forced into the world above, before men in coats and tie pins could translate it back into something survivable. The passage to relay access rose through old concrete like the inside of a throat. Matthias ran with the bag slamming against his hip, his injured shoulder burning with each stride, his breath growing ragged in the dry, filtered air. Behind him, the bunker had fully awakened into pursuit. Alarms no longer pulsed in controlled intervals. They layered, search tones, door cycle warnings, containment notices. Somewhere overhead, heavy locks engaged one after another in a sequence that sounded almost ceremonial. Bureaucracy, even in panic, preferred choreography. At the final bend, the corridor widened into a service chamber lit by 2 failing fluorescent strips and the blue-white glow of active equipment beyond. Relay access. He had returned almost to where the truth first became legible on a screen. Only now it was no longer theory, no longer a shape seen through folders and dead funds. It was in his bag, Falk's memorandum, the crash site photographs, continuity sheets, the memorandum naming the men a living attenuation layer, Henrik's recorded voice refusing the heroic lie that had buried him alive. This was proof ordinary people could understand, and that was precisely why it was so fragile. He reached the relay room, shut the door behind him, and slid the old mechanical bolt out of instinct. Though he knew it would not stop a determined security team for long, the maintenance terminal still glowed on the desk where he had left it. Its directory tree remained open. An alert banner crawled across the bottom now. Node security review in progress. Remote authentication escalation pending. Pending. Time then. Some little shred of it. Little shred. Matthias dumped the bag onto the desk with shaking hands and forced himself into order. Camera card, documents, cassette, duplicate keys, phone, notebook. Every movement felt too slow because he could imagine the men already on the stairs. But panic corrupted sequence, and sequence was all he had ever truly trusted. He inserted the camera card first. The terminal recognized external media, but warned that removable exports were under audit lock. Fine. He no longer needed removable export. He needed transmission. Eva Lindner's number was in his memory. Cologne, investigative desk, publishes first, apologizes later. He activated the relay's emergency maintenance uplink. The interface fought him with permissions prompts, but the holding credentials still retained outbound telecom diagnostics, enough to open a hidden packet tunnel beyond the facility firewall, exactly as the anonymous note had promised. He connected his private phone by cable, powered it on, and watched the signal jump not to a civilian network, but to a raw relay bridge route with no public branding at all. He dialed Eva Lindner. It rang twice. A woman answered, voice sharp with irritation and sleep torn open too quickly. Lindner? My name is Matthias Voss. Petra Weiss told me to call only if I had proof people could understand. Silence. Then instantly awake. Where are you? No time. Listen carefully. I have documentary and audio evidence that the 1988 Bundeswehr helicopter crash near Baumholder was staged after the fact. 12 declared dead soldiers survived and were secretly held for decades in a subterranean containment facility in the Eifel. They were not just quarantined. They were used as a living barrier because something at a deeper site reacted to them, and they to it. The government already has narrative templates prepared to frame this as a heroic medical secrecy program if exposed. Another silence, but this one professional, not disbelieving. Can you transmit now? Yes. Then do not summarize further. Send everything. Originals, photographs, audio, route logs, documents with seals, anything naming ministries or dates. If this is real, they will try to drown it in abstraction within the hour. I need the human core first. Human core. Henrik's voice. Matthias uploaded the audio cassette recording through the phone bridge first, then the crash site photographs, then the memorandum describing the living attenuation layer, then the casualty discrepancy report proving the men were alive post-event. Progress bars crawled across the screen with unbearable slowness. Outside the relay room, a door slammed. Voices, too close. He continued sending. Eva remained on the line, her voice low now, controlled, occasionally cutting in only to confirm receipt. Audio received. Photographs received. Then after a pause that seemed longer than it could have been, my God. The phrase was quiet and unperformed. That was how Matthias knew she had understood. He sent Falk's note, the continuity records, the transport schedule showing Adler pending transfer, the lift schematic, and finally the press templates from external narrative management. Let her see the lie preparing itself in advance. Let her show the country not just the wound, but the script already drafted to explain the blood away. The relay terminal flashed. Remote security override attempted. He yanked the cable free and began forwarding the same core packet bundle to every address Lindner dictated in rapid sequence. Her editor, an off-site legal archive, 2 mirrored investigative servers, 1 international partner outlet in case domestic injunctions came fast. He did not know whether redundancy would save anything. He only knew singular truths died easily. The relay room door shuddered under an impact from outside. Once, then again. Metal groaned in the frame. How much more? Lindner asked. Matthias looked at the remaining files. Too many, too technical, too easy to lose the public in. He chose instead one last transmission, Henrik's recorded sentence. If they tell the country we died as heroes, do not believe the heroic part. We were buried because we were useful. That line would survive headlines. It would survive spin. It would survive the instinctive recoil of ordinary readers when the deeper parts of amber became difficult to name. He sent it as text, audio transcript, and image from the memorandum all together. The bolt on the door tore free. A crack of light opened at the jamb. Matthias, Lindner said, her voice suddenly more personal than journalistic. Listen to me. We have enough to publish a first break and enough mirrors that seizure won't kill it. Get out if you can. He almost laughed. Get out if you can, as if people ever truly got out of structures like this. The door burst inward. 2 black-clad response officers entered first. One low, one high, weapons trained not yet to fire but to dominate the room. Behind them came the defense representative, overcoat still immaculate despite the bunker chaos below. The same man, the same type-in. But whatever composure had once made him look merely bureaucratic had begun to fray. He looked like a person who had spent too long converting impossible realities into survivable paragraphs, and had just realized one paragraph too many had escaped him. "Step away from the terminal," he said. Matthias remained where he was, phone still at his ear. "Too late," he answered. The representative's eyes flicked once to the screen, taking in the outbound session logs. For the first time in all their encounters, emotion surfaced plainly. Not rage, defeat. Small, precise, and instantly suppressed. "Disconnect the node," he ordered. One of the officers moved to the rack. Lindner's voice came faintly through the phone. "Are they there?" "Yes," Matthias said. "Good," she replied. "Then let them hear this part. The first alert is already live." The representative heard it. Matthias saw the meaning land, already live. He stepped forward. "Give me the phone." "Why?" "So you can improve the wording?" Matthias asked. The officer nearest him struck the phone from his hand. It skidded across the floor and cracked against the base of a cabinet. But not before Lindner's last words reached the room through the speaker in a brief burst of static. "We're publishing the photographs first." The representative closed his eyes for 1 second. Photographs first. Of course, not theories, not subterranean anomalies. Burned wreckage, body pouches loaded from another incident, living men declared dead. Images that could not be made to sound hysterical by the simple trick of sounding strange. When he opened his eyes again, the machinery of control had returned, but thinner. "Take him," he said. The officers moved. Matthias did not resist much. Enough to be handled as a man, not dragged as an object. Enough to keep one last fragment of choice inside the inevitable. His shoulder gave way when they pinned his arms. Pain flooded white through his upper body. Someone cuffed his wrists. Someone else shut down the terminal, though what mattered had already crossed the line between hidden and public. As they hauled him up the stairwell toward the surface, the bunker's alarms continued beneath them. And once, only once, he heard again that unclassifiable sound from below. The low, impossible pressure wave moving through rock and steel. It reminded him that even now, after exposure, the deepest truth would remain partly buried. Not because he had failed to reveal it all, but because language itself might never fully bridge the distance between ordinary life and whatever the state had disturbed in those caves decades ago. By the time they brought him above ground, dawn had widened over the reserve. The public face of the place looked obscene in daylight. The educational annex, the tasteful fencing, the conservation signage wet with morning mist. Somewhere beyond the tree line, he heard engines, multiple vehicles arriving too quickly and with too little respect for environmental gravel. Not only security now, press, regional police perhaps, external oversight, too many witnesses for the site to remain a secret chamber, pretending to be a wildlife center. They put him in the back of a dark vehicle without markings. He expected a hood. He received none. That was how he knew the strategy had changed. Physical disappearance would only sharpen the story now. Visibility, managed and softened, would serve them better. The drive did not take him to a prison. It took him to a comfortable federal guest house outside Bonn, ordinarily used for discreet protected residences during sensitive inquiries. House arrest without the ugly name. Carpeted rooms, monitored windows, decent coffee, state linens. The civilized face of containment. When the first major news alerts broke that afternoon, they did so exactly as Lindner had promised and exactly as the representative had feared. Photographs first, then the audio, then the leaked memoranda. The country learned, in stages it could metabolize, that 12 soldiers declared dead in 1988 had in fact survived and been secretly held in a government-run containment program. That crash records had been falsified, that civilian accounts had funded the deception, that families had been denied the truth for decades. And then, as always, the state began translating. A press conference was assembled with astonishing speed. Ministers spoke of a tragic Cold War emergency, of unprecedented medical risk, of imperfect decisions made under impossible circumstances, of a long-term quarantine program intended to protect the public while preserving the lives of affected servicemen. They did not deny the staged crash exactly. They absorbed it into the language of historical necessity and bureaucratic overreach. They praised the resilience of the surviving men. They promised independent review. They did not once use the phrase living attenuation layer. They did not speak of amber depth. They did not speak of the lower site pressure variance, the subsonic tremors, the smell in the postcards, or the way Henrik Adler had whispered, "not down." Those truths remained below the threshold of what could be safely televised. The representative had been right in one way. Exposure did not produce moral clarity. It produced translation. Yet translation was not total victory for them either, because once photographs and voices enter the world, they resist perfect management. Widows speak. Archivists remember. Former staff begin looking for exits from their own silence. Parliamentary committees ask the wrong questions. Journalists keep digging where official summaries beg them to stop. The public version may arrive polished, but it does not remain obedient forever. 3 days into his monitored residence, Matthias received confirmation through his lawyer that Sabine was safe and had returned to the apartment only briefly before staying again with Lena. Petra, suspended but not charged, had retained counsel and refused all internal interviews beyond procedural necessity. Clara Neumann had been quietly offered state mediation and had refused it through a single sentence passed to the press. "I asked for truth, not furniture in a nicer room." Henrik Adler's name, for the first time since 1988, appeared in public not as a death notice, but as a living witness under medical protection. No journalist was allowed to see him. No court yet compelled full access, so even now the truth remained incomplete. That was the price of realities buried too long. When finally exposed, they came up coated in institutional soil, still attached to the roots that had fed on them. On the 7th evening, just after dusk, Matthias sat alone in the guest house study with a blanket over his knees and a glass of mineral water he had not touched. Outside, security lights warmed the garden path into a false softness. Somewhere beyond the monitored hedges, traffic moved on a distant federal road with the anonymous persistence of national life continuing past scandal. He should have felt triumph. He did not. He felt older, not morally vindicated, simply older. He had broken the lie open, yes, but he had not rescued the men from what they had become inside the state's architecture. He had not explained the lower depths. He had not even fully protected the people around him. Sabine's fear could not be unpublished. Petra's career would never return intact. Falk remained dead. The young orderly had vanished from every official mention, which troubled him more than any statement from ministers. And somewhere under the acceptable story now circulating on television, Amber, or whatever name it would take next, still possessed rooms the public had not yet seen. A knock came at the door. One of the house staff entered with the evening mail on a silver tray, as if this were a spa and not a velvet-lined perimeter. "Only one item tonight, Herr Voss," the man said politely. After he left, Matthias looked at the tray. A postcard lay there, blank front except for a photograph of a forest road under winter trees. His pulse slowed rather than rose. He already knew before touching it what the paper would smell like, ozone, and beneath it that bitter mineral note from the hills. No message on the back, no signature, only his name, neatly typed. Matthias turned the card over once more, holding it under the lamp. This one contained no hidden slip that he could find. Or perhaps it did, buried more carefully than before. Perhaps that was the point. Some truths, even after exposure, refused to emerge all at once. He sat with the postcard in both hands and listened to the quiet house arranged around him by people who called confinement care when the furniture was good enough. Somewhere in Germany, committees were forming, stories were being translated. Records were being cleaned, contested, duplicated, and leaked. Perhaps one day amber depth would become speakable. Perhaps not. Perhaps Henrik Adler would yet see Clara in a room above ground and remember enough of ordinary life to know he had returned to it. Perhaps the state would manage even that reunion into symbolism. Matthias no longer trusted, perhaps. But he trusted residue. The truth had broken the surface, not cleanly, not completely. Yet once something that large begins to rise, it stains everything around it. He placed the postcard on the table and looked toward the dark window, seeing only his reflection and the soft lamp behind it. There are mysteries that end when facts arrive and others that begin there. If this story stays with you, if you believe some truths are buried not in darkness but in paperwork, then stay with this channel, leave your thoughts below, and keep listening. Sometimes the most frightening questions are the ones that survive exposure.